I'm Walt Carpenter, and my story begins in the office of Dr. Nancy Royce, a court-appointed consultant. Where to begin? Okay, Doc, I think I know. It happened when I heard a scream over the loud whirring of a circular saw while working in the basement building shelves. As I started to walk up the stairs, I saw my daughter Lynn already running down the hallway towards the front door. I wasn't sure where the scream came from, but I figured Lynn knew better since she was in the downstairs family room talking on the phone. At 45, it took me a while to catch up with my 18-year-old daughter, but the source of the scream became visible as I ran out the screen door. There, at our street mailbox, stood my 42-year-old loving wife, with whom we have been married for 21 years, waving a large envelope and some kind of laminated large ticket above her head. I also noticed a film crew running towards my wife from a van parked across the street. On Saturday, it seemed like all of our neighbors were home and were now standing on their lawns and porches watching my wife scream and squeal. I was confused to say the least. I finally joined my daughter in the front yard as Sherry continued to jump and sometimes even spin. I believe in competitive figure skating these moves are called double and triple axels. She was still screaming, but now we noticed that she was laughing the whole time, which calmed us down a little, but did little to explain what was happening. Seeing me for the first time since I walked onto the lawn, Sherry screamed my name, ran up to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me hard on the lips. Truth be told, even though Sherry means the world to me, her little public display was the closest thing to sex we've had in the last couple of months, if not longer. She just didn't feel like being intimate with me lately, and I didn't know why. Maybe we've just reached a dead end, but, okay, I digress. My daughter just watched and, confused, asked, "Mom?" Having not noticed her daughter until that moment, Sherry screamed, "Oh, Lynn, I can't believe this happened. I mean, it really happened." The crew continued filming as Lynn asked, "What are you talking about, Mom?" "America is watching. I was chosen to be on the show. Oh my God, I was chosen to be on AC." I looked at the crew and a couple of other people following them with papers and briefcases and saw that they were all wearing ITN t-shirts, jackets, and caps. ITN is the network that broadcasts the show America is watching. Suddenly it dawned on me why my wife was so excited. Sherry was a big fan of the reality show America is watching, and apparently she was chosen to participate. Of course, fans of the show usually call it AC, and the network's promotional stories always call it America's favorite reality show. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, and I don't really care. One thing I knew was that Sherry was one of those big fans, certainly the biggest fan in our area and possibly the entire state. If she had actually been chosen to be on her favorite show, that would explain a lot, both the screaming and the crew. The mystery has been solved. The camera crew continued to film my wife's celebration, while my daughter and I looked on in confusion and some apprehension. I knew the basic rules of the so-called game because I had watched it with Sherry many times. The game was quite simple. Of course, any game show becomes understandable after 15 years of watching it with your wife. During every episode, she explained every strategy and every little detail. The basic premise is that 16 strangers are placed in a house built on a film set. There seem to be 16 of them, but who really knows? They then vote each week for one of the guests to leave the house, even though the show airs 3 times a week. Whoever gets kicked out on eviction night is sent home, unless they are one of the final 8 contestants, in which case they are sent to the pier house. It's another house in a secret location where the evicted contestants spend a mini vacation of sorts while waiting to be voted on as the winner from the 2 remaining contestants in the show's finale. Every week there are competitions, the winner of which becomes the leader of the house. This person nominates 2 candidates for eviction. Now that I think about it, maybe the rules of the game aren't that simple, but that doesn't matter. My story will not be a retelling of that fateful season that changed my family's life forever. The game itself isn't that important at this point, it never was, but since I started describing the rules, I'll finish. So, these competitions can be both physical and mental. I knew she could handle any mental challenge well, but Sherry is as athletic as a sack of flour. But winning competitions is not always necessary. If someone makes a good alliance, they can go quite far, even win, if they play their cards right. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that there are hidden cameras and microphones throughout the house. They don't miss anything. Cameras zoom in whether you're in the kitchen, bedrooms, or shower. Apart from the house leader for the week who gets his own room, the remaining bedrooms are shared between 4 or 5 members. The microphones they use are impressive. Although many on the show whisper, the microphones pick up their voices as if they were speaking in a normal tone and reveal all the forgeries, deceptions, and betrayals for which the show is famous. These are the factors that will destroy my world. Eventually, we all went into the house where the Itten staff laid the contracts in front of my wife to sign. I immediately asked for a few minutes to discuss this. To their credit, they all walked out of the kitchen onto the deck, but it was obvious that they knew Sherry would eventually sign the contract despite what I said. My daughter and I were the only ones who thought otherwise. I started the conversation, but I'm not sure my wife knew what I was even saying. My daughter was also unlucky. Listen, honey, I know you're a big fan of this show and everything, but I have my doubts about your participation. Yes, Mom. This is my last summer before college, and I really wanted to spend it with you. Sherry just frowned and said, I expected my family to be a little more supportive. I mean, it's a dream come true. You know I never miss an episode, and here's my chance to be on the show. You don't. Do you understand? Of course I understand, honey. We both do. But you have to see our point of view. We're both going to miss you. Hell, you could be on the show for almost 3 months. She laughed. You just don't want me hanging out with the cute young guys on the show. My daughter looked at me, waiting for my response to her mother, and I answered as honestly as possible. I'm not happy about this, if you want to know the truth. Is my husband jealous? I nodded. You know that I'm jealous. I always have been. You do not trust me. It's not that I don't trust you. I just don't trust other men. In case you haven't noticed, there are men who don't respect other people's marriages. Oh dear, I'll miss you too, both of you, but everything will be okay. And Lynn, I promise I will make it up to you. I promise. Lynn wasn't about to give up and replied, This is my last summer at home, Mom. If you actually stay on the show as long as you say, I'll be off to college in Maine. When are you going to make it up to me after I get married? When Lynn called Sherry Mom, I knew she was desperate. Sherry started talking about what she needed to bring, as if Lynn and I hadn't said anything. I'm going to have to buy new underwear, shorts, and tank tops, and a swimsuit. I have to be prepared to attract attention. You know what I mean. I stared at her. What do you mean get attention? She giggled. I might have to dress sexy to get attention. Being on the show is great, but I'm going to play it to the max. I've always said that if I ever get a chance to be on the show, I'll do almost everything to win. What the hell do you mean? I was starting to get angry because it seemed like she wasn't joking. She smiled, but there was something almost sinister in her smile as she replied, I guess it all depends on who wants me in their alliance and what it will take to be the last one standing. I was ready to explode and raised my voice. Oh my God, Sherry, I don't think you're kidding. Don't worry, honey. I promise not to have a full-blown romance on the show, but if I can get what I want with a little provocation, then why not? Lynn was outraged. Mom, are you really saying that you're ready to have an affair with someone other than Dad? No, Lynn. Like I said, maybe just flirt a little. It's just part of the game. Doesn't sound like a game to me. What if someone wants to kiss you? It would kill Daddy, and I wouldn't like it either. Sherry backed down. I don't think it will come to that, Lynn. I love your father too much to do anything that would hurt him. Besides, it's just a TV show, and I'm sure they don't. They will allow someone to take advantage of an old married woman like me. All this is for fun. I interrupted her. What do you mean you don't think it will come to that? It still sounds like you're willing to do whatever it takes to win just like you said before. No, honey, I said I'd do almost anything to win, and that's still true. What you don't understand is that this is the chance of my life. I noticed you still haven't explained what you meant when you said you didn't think it would come to that, referring to kissing some guy. Oh, honey, don't be ridiculous. Think about what we can do with the extra money. We don't need extra money. What do you want that you don't have? She smiled and replied, We'll figure something out when I win $500,000. Isn't that important? I shook my head and replied sharply, Not as important as our marriage and family, and you were clearly avoiding my other question, weren't you? She didn't answer. I wasn't sure she was even listening. It was as if someone had replaced my wife with a selfish, insensitive, and unsympathetic copycat. How is this even possible? So it was not surprising when my wife ignored my pleas, and as soon as the network people returned through the sliding doors from the back deck, my wife immediately signed the contract, thereby sealing the deal. Our daughter and I could only shake our heads in disbelief at the clear disrespect Sherry showed our family. Sherry was over the moon, while we were much less enthusiastic. It was obvious that Sherry was caught up in the glitz and glamour of going to Hollywood and being on a TV show. The Itten woman said, You know, we find it difficult to sign up. Let's put it this way, mature housewives to appear on the show. More often than not, they are afraid of what their husbands will think when they see their wives on national television surrounded by young, single men who sometimes want to find a mate. As you know, we call it romance on the show, and such things are very popular with our viewers. You must be a very open person, Mr. Carpenter. You couldn't be more wrong, sister. She smiled, almost not noticing my answer, and continued. We at Eton have always wondered what would happen if a faithful wife cheated while on our show. It has never happened, but it would be interesting, wouldn't it? I didn't answer. If I had responded, I would have used words that would be considered inappropriate when addressing a woman. One thing was clear, she carefully made sure that my wife signed the contract before telling me that last detail. She then added, without any remorse, to say, But I'm sure that won't happen in this case. You should be proud of your wife. Mrs. Carpenter is a very attractive woman, a wife and mother. With her long blonde hair and petite body, she looks much younger than her early 40s. She could easily pass for a woman in her late 20s. I'd be shocked if one of the young guys we signed for the show wasn't interested in her, and I don't just mean acting. Mrs. Carpenter is clearly a smart woman and appears to be one of the strong players this season, and she appears to be ready to win and isn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way of winning $500,000. I replied sarcastically, Yeah, I noticed. I didn't even let my family stop me, right? Well, Mr. Carpenter, you have a wonderful wife and a real little dynamo, I must say. She's a wonderful addition to our show and a real beauty. I wouldn't be surprised if our ratings improved just because of her presence, and if she makes it to the finals, so much the better for us. But in the end, you probably don't have to worry about it. Probably. All I could think about was, did she just tell me that I probably had nothing to worry about? Is she kidding me? Probably. The woman from the network then told us that every night at 10 o'clock, we would get the cable channel for free. It's an extra 2 hours of the show, and since it's on cable, some more explicit scenes and language are allowed. She said, They don't show everything, but they allow quite a lot. More than in the broadcast. What do you mean more? I asked. Well, you know, some harsh language and some of the steamier scenes if there's romance on the show. I just stared at her in disbelief, wanting to throw her back into her van. She added, Sherry says you guys watch the show together, so you probably already know what romance is like on the show. Yes, I understand perfectly well what it is. Seeing my discomfort with the topic, she gathered up her papers and put them in her briefcase, all the while my wife sat at the table, going over her schedule, which included picking up a limousine early Monday morning and getting to the airport for a flight to Los Angeles. We weren't even going to take her to the airport. It was hard for Lynn and me, but Sherry didn't seem bothered. You could tell she was thrilled not only to be on the show, but also to be away from her family for a while. It was hard to tell exactly what she was thinking because she had never acted like this before. She was immersed in a fantasy world, and I was afraid that her head was no longer in the right place. In a short period of time, she has changed, and not for the better. The ink had not yet dried, but the network team had already begun to pack up and head to our front door. One of the women said to my wife, "Then can I tell my executive producer that you are determined and are going to play it the right way?" Sherry quickly responded, "Absolutely. I can hardly wait." Sherry then turned to me and added, "Don't get too jealous, Walt. It's just a game." The woman simply replied, "Keep it up. You have a plane ticket, so see you on Monday. Enjoy your last day and a half with your family, and get ready for the greatest experience of your life, other than being with your husband, of course." Sherry giggled. "God, I hope it's better than this." I heard what she said and wasn't sure if I was more hurt or angry at that moment. Now, looking back, I would say I was more angry. She then followed the network team to the van, discussing the final details of the show. The rest of the weekend was busy. When everyone left, I couldn't help but beg her to stay with her family. I explained that I had a bad feeling about the whole thing, but she simply brushed it off, saying that everything would be fine and that I had nothing to worry about. Later on Saturday, she said she needed to do some last-minute shopping for the show and also get her hair done. I felt bad for Lynn because Sherry left without even asking if our daughter wanted to go with her. On Sunday afternoon, tensions increased. I wanted to warn her again that one of the guys on the show might try to hit on her, but I thought it best not to. She already knew I was jealous, but I assumed she knew it was because I loved her so much. Instead, I reminded her that she was my wife and the mother of our daughter, and that she should remember that while she was away from us. Her response to this was both worried and confused. "So you think I'm not attractive enough to attract the attention of another man, especially a young man? Do you think of me only as a wife and mother? Is that all?" I stood up and left the room so as not to say or do anything stupid. I loved Sherry more than anything, but the way she approached the show was disturbing. Lynn was speechless, and I think I was too. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing, especially because my loving wife was ignoring our feelings. My wife was always a little flirty, but as far as I knew, it was only with our friends, and even then I was always around so it never went overboard. Now she was going to be alone, and I had no way to protect her if necessary. What was even more disturbing was that she not only planned to tease and flirt on the show, she was looking forward to it. I think most people have a secret fantasy, but most people would never think of acting on it. If this was her secret fantasy, she planned to fulfill it at the expense of her family. This, of course, was not typical for her, so there was hope that she would come out of the dysfunction before doing something she would later regret. The worst thing about it all seemed to be that there was no way to bring some sense into her, and she was walking into a situation that she had no control over, as much as she thought she could. As for me, I already felt that I had lost control, and she had not yet left the house. I had a very bad feeling about this whole America is watching thing, and my fears were soon realized. Monday morning, Sherry was in the shower with the door locked. I called her, saying that I had to leave for work, expecting a big kiss and hug from my wife, whom I might not see for almost 3 months. She instead yelled at me that she had to finish getting ready because the limo would be there in an hour. Of course, I heard all this through the sound of water. Without any effort on her part to show me any regret about leaving me for almost 12 weeks, she instead shouted through the door, "See you after I win AC. Love you." It was far from sincere. No hugs, not a kiss, not a joke. Damn, she usually kisses me when she goes to the mailbox, and now I don't get a kiss when she might be away for almost 3 months. I know she's excited to be on the show, but realizing that I didn't even get a goodbye kiss really affected me. I wasn't sure whether to mention this to Lynn, but decided that she should be warned that her mother was acting increasingly out of character and that perhaps she should be prepared for the same treatment. Lynn was making breakfast, and I told her what had just happened upstairs. She was shocked and upset. She hugged me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I wish I knew what came over her. Let's talk about it over dinner tonight. Love you." I smiled as best I could and replied, "I love you too, Punkin." When I walked out the door, I felt sick. Arriving at work, I immediately went to the toilet. When I returned home that evening, there was a message from Sherry on our answering machine. "Hey, Walt. It's just me. They said I could call you one last time from the limo, so here it is. Didn't want to bother you at work, and frankly, was afraid you'd try to talk me out of participating again on the show. I have to stay focused, honey. It's for our future. It's so exciting. I've never been in a limousine, let alone called someone from one on the way to the airport to fly to Los Angeles. Lynn said you were a little upset that I didn't come out of the shower to say goodbye to you, but I was in a hurry, as you probably know. Well, I have a couple of people coming with me from the network, and they will give me more details on what to expect. See you soon. Hopefully not too soon, if you know what I mean. Bye, and don't forget to watch tomorrow night at 8. That's all. It almost sounded like one sentence, as if they were telling her that she could say whatever she wanted if she could do it in one breath. Although we were not allowed to have contact with each other until she left the show one way or another, she decided to call home and leave me a short, insincere message, knowing that by the time I heard it, she would already be in California. There was no apology for not kissing me goodbye. Instead, I had to listen to a ridiculous excuse. Well, I actually felt better about the whole America is watching thing. Although I was glad she reminded me to watch the show tomorrow night because I had forgotten about it until that moment. Now, that should be sarcastic enough for you, Doc. So it's Tuesday, the first night of the show. Part of me couldn't wait to see my wife. I wanted her to succeed while she lived out her dream of being on her favorite TV show. I was just worried about how far she was willing to go to succeed and achieve her dream. All that was left to do was wait. Some of our friends had a party for America is watching. I had no desire to go because I hate parties in general, but despite all my efforts, I still ended up at a party. What made it hard to avoid this event was that they held it in our living room. At 8 o'clock, the show started, and everyone at the party screamed along with the studio audience in Los Angeles. I immediately felt sick and wasn't sure why. It was just a gut feeling, and I've always been a proponent of trusting intuition. The show started, and they started introducing the guests one by one. The first time they show the contestants in the house is when they receive their ticket into the house. It wasn't clear at first, but they finally showed Sherry at our mailbox in front of our house. Everyone in our living room screamed. It was really strange to see my wife receiving our mail on national television, but here it is. They showed a short interview with her, where she claims to be happily married and the mother of a teenager. She briefly added that, being a huge fan of the game, she wants to win more than anything and is willing to do almost anything to win. This was said with a sly smile, which the so-called happy wife and mother should not have. Now it's time for the live broadcast. They stood backstage before going out in front of the studio audience to have their 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol once suggested. I was only attracted to 3 people. The first one was the 10th or 11th present, my wife. She looked great. However, she always looks beautiful, so it's not surprising. God, how I loved this woman. I always felt like the luckiest guy in the world when I was with her. She had the perfect girl next door image, and I, on the other hand, was just average on my best days. But she always said that I was all she needed, and before this strange obsession with the game, I believed her. Not even a little time after the first show, I began to doubt, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the next one was introduced to a young guy from Oklahoma. His name was Harley, not that I remembered it right away. The guy looked like he played football in college. He was almost all muscle, and I could be wrong, but I think he wanted to win the game so he could have enough money for his neck. The last one introduced was some young guy from Atlanta. If I've ever seen a man I immediately wanted to punch in the face, it was him. His name was Jake, and for some reason I remembered it right away. Something told me Jake was an arrogant bastard from the start. Again, it was a gut feeling, but then everything in his behavior told me that I was right. Soon everyone ran into the house to choose their beds in one of the 3 shared bedrooms, consisting of 5 beds. No wonder I saw Jake go after Sherry. It didn't ease my fears. The guests sat in the living room, talking and getting to know each other. Sometimes these participants lied to gain an advantage. I half expected Sherry to say that she was a former dancer and still single, waiting for Mr. Right. To my relief, she told the other participants that she was happily married and the mother of a daughter who would be going to college in the fall. Actually, she was wrong. Lynn will start college at the end of the summer. She also didn't mention that if she stayed on the show long enough, she might miss her only daughter leaving for her freshman year of college. Of course, she didn't mention that her loving husband was not happy about his wife moving out and living with strangers, which could take a quarter of a year. Towards the end of their first small meeting, they all entered the kitchen and continued talking, this time more informally. I wasn't sure if I saw what I thought I saw, but I thought I saw arrogant bastard Jake cast his arrogant eyes at my Sherry. I'm not sure how many others noticed, but I knew a few did by the way they turned and looked at me. My heart broke when Lynn turned to me, and I saw in her eyes the same doubts and fears that I felt. I just sat there like a stone, wanting to call the network and tell them to bring my wife back, or maybe it was just my imagination, but I think the general mood in our living room changed after that, and not for the better. The show went on, and they held a competition to determine the first house leader. This man got his own bedroom for a week. Before we go any further, I would like to remind you that these are adults participating in these stupid acts, including my wife. As the season premiere came to an end, they showed the contestants going to their rooms to unpack. The host then told viewers about a cable broadcast they could order from their local provider. The cable show was scheduled to begin immediately after Thursday's show, so viewers had time to order. As the credits rolled, our friends and neighbors began talking to each other and preparing to leave. My eyes were still glued to the screen when I noticed how the arrogant bastard named Jake not only took the bed next to my wife, but also smiled at the camera as he moved it a little closer to her bed. To say I didn't sleep well that first night would be an understatement. It's Thursday, and it's time for the second show. Most of the show consisted of recorded footage from Tuesday until today. This time, it was just family in our living room. Besides Lynn and me, Sherry's sister Vicky, her husband, and Sherry's parents were there. By the end of the show, I was glad there were no others, but wished her family had stayed home too. Things were about to take a turn for the worst, and although I had bigger problems to worry about, every now and then I would remember that the whole neighborhood was watching. And when there were commercial breaks or promos, they would mention the name of the show, which immediately reminded me that America was actually watching. How else? It didn't take long before the participants began plotting and forming alliances or teams. It's hard to believe, but people were already planning betrayal. Jake and Harley were shown forming an alliance, and Jake immediately came up with the idea of involving a little blonde housewife. Says she'll probably do whatever they want, and that they can put her in the final 3. Harley asked Jake if he thought she could really help them. Jake chuckled and replied, "In many ways." No one dared to look at me this time. I truly believed that they sensed my rage, which was quickly becoming a close companion to my grief. There was no doubt that they were targeting my wife, not only as a participant alliance, but also as a possible romance on the show. There was also no doubt that there was little I could do about it. In week 2, Jake had already talked to Sherry about joining their alliance, and to say he complimented her would be a gross understatement. Speaking in a whisper to avoid the attention of others, but being perfectly picked up by the microphones, he began by saying that they needed a smart player and someone they could trust, and said that they wanted to see her through to the end of the game. He then said that she had a great chance of winning because he really wanted to be there for her and not Harley when the vote for the winner came. She listened, and I could see that she believed his lies. Then he said that everyone will definitely vote for the pretty wife and mother, not for him when it comes to it. She blushed and whispered, "Do you really think I'm beautiful?" I could see by his smile that he thought there was potential for an affair with my wife. This son of a bitch was eloquent, I had to admit, and I had no doubt that he had seduced married women before and was going to take it slow and steady. He didn't need to rush. She wasn't going anywhere unless she was kicked out, and by this time he and Harley were running the house, so that wasn't likely. He also didn't have to worry about an angry husband because I couldn't get to him. Looking back, I think he was already enjoying making fun of me. Luckily, it was only Lynn and I watching this time. Well, at least in our house. Our family, neighbors, and the rest of America were watching somewhere else. It wasn't too humiliating, was it? Now my fears are stuck in my throat. But Lynn and I watched each show 3 times a week, and almost a month into the show, things started to pick up steam. Up until this point, Lynn and I had noticed the little things that happen when two people start dating. Light touches when talking, playfulness that usually leads to something more serious, and eyes that tell the other person that they know exactly what they're thinking. Plus, Jake had another trick up his sleeve. His seduction regimen took on a new approach that was both brilliant and sinister. This was the week he started subtly humiliating me every chance he got. It started on Tuesday. While everyone else was in the kitchen, Jake took Sherry aside and was now in the bedroom with her. Although Sherry was the topic of conversation among the other participants, everyone saw what was happening, and most of the young people thought it was funny. The divorced woman on the show, still younger than my wife, seemed genuinely concerned even though she didn't do anything about it. After seeing Sherry's behavior since she found out she was on the show, I believed that nothing a divorcee could say could stop Sherry. Anyway, they were in the bedroom, talking quietly, and at first it was about playing, but that didn't last long as Jake started asking Sherry about me. She spoke well of me, mostly, although every now and then she would say something that gave him an opportunity to sink his claws into me. An example of this was when she said that she sometimes feels like she is taken for granted. He immediately stood up and sat with her on her bed. I didn't really like it. He then said, "He probably doesn't want to be like that, Sherry. He doesn't seem like a bad guy. Maybe a little arrogant, but that doesn't make him a bad person." She nodded. Damn it, she actually nodded in agreement. He added, "He just doesn't seem to appreciate what he has." She sobbed slightly and said, "No, he's a really good person. It's just—" Before she could finish, he interrupted. "Wow, if I had a wife like you, I would never leave the house. I would definitely never leave you out of my sight." She thanked him. Can you believe it? She basically thanked the arrogant bastard for seducing her. He then took her hand and looked into her eyes as he said, "Damn, if you were mine, I'd never want to leave our bed." She blushed. She apparently forgot all the objections I raised when this all started. I did everything I could to make her stay home. She didn't want to hear anything. Over the course of the show, they showed more of his subtle, and sometimes not so subtle seduction of my wife, including a brief bedtime cuddle. By Sunday night, he was almost calling me a loser, and she wasn't defending me as hard as before, which really wasn't a big deal. The cable show was even worse after airing. There was also hugging and light touching, clearly inappropriate for a married woman with someone other than her husband. I'm not sure if she was trying to seduce him, but it certainly looked like it. Anyone watching could see what was happening, and it tore me apart that my wife couldn't see. It was obvious that Sherry had bought his lie. She definitely wasn't protecting me. So I decided that the next day I would talk to the show's producer, Zach whoever. I had to take Sherry off the show before more damage was done. While I could forgive her for a lot of what was going on, if it went any further, all bets were off. I couldn't sit idly by and hope things would change on their own, so I left work at noon on Monday to contact the show's producers. Because of the 3-hour time difference between the coasts, I had to wait until noon, and it was killing me. Every minute seemed like an hour as time dragged on. I finally got through to Zach Blevins, executive producer of America's Watching. Our conversation on the phone did not go smoothly and did not bode well. When I told him about my concerns, I begged him to talk to my wife and explain to her that she was putting her marriage at risk by staying on the show. His answer was cold and calculating, but not particularly surprising. Tell me, Mr. Carpenter, is this an emergency? Is someone sick or dying? If not, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do here at AC. What about my marriage? Isn't what's happening to my marriage an emergency? I'm sorry, Mr. Carpenter, I really am, but my hands are tied. Your wife signed the contract, and unless she is kicked out of the house by the other players, or she ultimately wins, the decision to stay or go is solely hers. But that's what I'm talking about. Could you at least talk to her? Explain to her that her family and friends are concerned about her behavior. I'm sure if she knew, she would come to her senses. I wasn't sure if this was the case, but I had to try something. He continued, Mr. Carpenter, from what I've seen, your wife is using her questionable behavior as a strategy to win this game. While it's none of my business whether I approve of this strategy or not, she doesn't break the law. He must have realized that I was unhappy with our conversation so far and continued, You see, Mr. Carpenter, even if I talked to your wife, it would affect everyone in the house, not just your family. Towards others, we also have fair play to consider. Fair play? You've got to be kidding me, right? You throw my wife into a situation with a predator and expect me to believe there's some kind of fair play involved? Listen, Mr. Carpenter, it's not what you think. For starters, Mrs. Carpenter applied to be on the show. We weren't looking for her. And while Jake isn't exactly the boy down the street, I can assure you that we're vetting very carefully. Numerous background checks were carried out on all of our guests, and all of them showed that this young man was clean. I was seething with anger, but he was right. She certainly didn't try to stop his advances. Even worse, was he right about the chemistry between them? How is this even possible? Suddenly, it felt like I had been hit in the stomach. All this time, I was trying to understand why I reacted so strongly to all these little touches and hugs, things that could seem so small and innocent, significant to others, but continued to break my heart every time I saw it. Oh my God, that's what it's all about, right? I just didn't want to admit it, but it's true. There really was chemistry between them. My Sherry, the love of my life and the mother of my child, seemed to have found chemistry with another man. In a matter of weeks, I went from being a happy husband to being replaced by his wife. What a fucking nightmare. I paused for a moment before speaking my realization out loud. This is all for ratings, right? His grin spread all over his face as he replied, Getting ratings is my job, Mr. Carpenter. How did I know he was smirking on the phone? Easily. I could actually hear that bastard's grin from coast to coast. He continued, Don't get me wrong, if either of us believed your wife was in immediate physical danger, we would have intervened immediately. I understand your concern. Your wife appears to be on the verge of cheating, and you feel helpless to stop it. This is completely understandable, but again, my job is ratings. I'm not a family consultant. So your ratings are good. Never been better. My bosses are very pleased. But I confess that I wish it didn't come at the expense of your family. I really think so. But please try to understand us. The whole country is watching your wife's every move to see if she will remain faithful to her husband or, well, I don't want to upset you anymore. It's too late for that, isn't it? I'll be honest with you. Can I call you Walt? No. Okay, then Mr. Carpenter. But I promise you that we did not plan for this to happen to your wife and the other young man. Young man, huh? He ignored me and continued. I won't lie, it's going better than we could have ever dreamed of here at Itten, but we've already done hundreds of shows over 15+ seasons, and nothing like this has ever happened. I mean, the married guest seemed ready to cheat. Knowing that she and her husband were happy and faithful in the beginning only adds to the intrigue. I was silent. I didn't know what to say. He added, Like I said, you have a wonderful family, and I'm really sorry this is happening to you. Yeah, it looks like it. It's true. Please don't misunderstand. When I say we're happy with how things are going, it's not personal. Again, ratings are our job, and your wife could be the best thing that ever happened to AC. I was about to hang up and lick my wounds when he said, "Not sure if someone has contacted you yet or not, but we are going to send a film crew to your home to set up a live feed from your living room for the upcoming show. I know that you and your daughter will be there and would love to see all your family and friends supporting Sherry. We will show everyone there cheering for Sherry. You will see her and she will see you. Although there will be no audio contact between you, she will be able to see that her family is okay and supporting her every step of the way." Was this guy even listening to our conversation? I then told him that letting his camera crew into our house would be a cold day in hell. Should I remind you that we have a signed contract from Sherry allowing us access to the house? He asked smugly, "Her name is on the mortgage, isn't it, Mr. Carpenter?" I muttered that yes, and he said, "Okay, expect them in the coming weeks. Is there anything else you need from me before?" The conversation ended right there when I hung up. I have never felt so alone and helpless in my life. Here I was married to what I thought was the most beautiful woman in the world, and she was 3,000 miles away, seduced by some smooth talker. The worst part was that I had to watch it every night. I sat in front of the TV and watched as she was slowly but surely seduced into the arms of another, and there was nothing I could do about it. Later that night, I watched as Jake continued to manipulate Sherry's emotions and seemed to touch her in a way that pushed all of her buttons. Then I saw her reactions and this damn chemistry they seemed to have. For the first time in my life, I wished that television had never been invented. Again, that gut feeling came back, telling me that there would be more, much more, and I would be forced to watch it from afar, with no hope of closure unless Sherry wanted it to happen. I felt so helpless. I had always trusted Sherry with my life, but now I wasn't so sure. I remember how we watched the previous seasons together, and she teased me, saying that she would pick up some handsome young guy if she got on the show. She knew it was driving me crazy because I was terribly jealous. She even suggested that one of the married women on the show should flirt or even have an affair to increase her chances of winning the game. I remember saying that this woman would be crazy to put her marriage on the line for some stupid game and that it wasn't worth it. She replied, "It might be worth it. Moreover, it might be a little exciting." When she saw that I was really getting angry and saying that if it were my wife, I would divorce her in an instant, she would giggle and say, "I love teasing you. You're so cute when you're jealous. You can't divorce me, and you know it." The thing is, despite her laughter, I always felt a spark in her eyes that said she might just go for it if given the chance. I never pursued this conversation any further because I thought, what were the chances of her being chosen to be on the show? So, my logic failed me. In an attempt to avoid conflict and not start an argument without reason, I watched my wife being seduced on national television. I guess we should have argued then, but who would have thought that she would ever be chosen to be on this damn show? Despite what many may think, I'm not a complete idiot. Not to say I don't have my moments. I realized that Zach Blevins had ulterior motives. The ratings must have been through the roof, judging by the talk in our hometown. I never thought he would be too kind, and I was right. I was a little surprised that he didn't want to come forward at all and at least talk to Sherry on the side, but mostly I expected him to turn a deaf ear to my requests. Then why bother at all, you ask? Until that moment, I saw no other way out. The next day, when I left early again to meet with a lawyer with the contract Sherry signed, I didn't feel any better. For now, I'll just say that it all ended badly. Now, before you criticize me too harshly for everything I may or may not have done, and wonder why I didn't do this or that, let me defend myself. Although I said that I am not a complete idiot, I am a simple person. On a good day, I'm an average guy. What I mean is, I'm average height, maybe average looking, and I have a regular job. I'm not familiar with television, lawyers, or the complexities of contracts. Even though I consider myself a boring, somewhat dull guy, at the end of the day, I consider myself a loving and caring husband and father who is willing to do whatever it takes to protect his loved ones. What I am not is a former Army Ranger or Navy SEAL. Few of us are like that, and for good reason. I'm not a former CIA agent or a spy with a bunch of spy gadgets. I'm not trained in martial arts, I haven't had my first fight yet, and I've never had any desire to take a ninja class at the mall. I've played a lot of sports, so I'm not completely out of shape, but I'm also not a weightlifter or marathon runner. Now imagine that you are just an average family man without much training. Your life is perfect in every way. You have a loving and faithful wife, a beautiful daughter, good friends, and you mow your lawn once a week in the summer. Perfect, right? Stay with me here. You're just going with the flow, and suddenly life sneaks up on you when you least expect it and hits you where it hurts the most. Then, as you fall to the ground in extreme pain, life slaps you in the face for good measure. Do you know what I mean? Nothing I had done in the past, either physically or mentally, prepared me for the situation in which I found myself. Like I said, on a good day, I'm average. What I still am is a very irritated, jealous husband, completely lost and without any direction. I couldn't get to the man who seduced my wife because he was being protected, but don't doubt for a second that if I had the chance, I would have beaten him to a pulp. Then again, I might not have stopped and gotten rid of his body somewhere far from the beaten path. As for my jealousy, which, by the way, I don't consider excessive, but it is still there, I happily admit that it comes from my own insecurities. I never thought I would find someone as perfect for me as Sherry was, and the thought of losing her was too painful to think about. I may be average and boring, but I have a pretty big temperament that I try my best to control, if only to be around my daughter. I believed that my daughter, along with her sister and Sherry's parents, were on my side and most wanted my wife to come to her senses, but I had a feeling that friends, acquaintances, and the rest of America might have a different opinion. Despite Sherry's behavior on the show, it seemed like people couldn't get enough of the potential cheating wife and family that could be torn apart by a woman too caught up in the moment to understand what was going on around her. I had spoken to the lawyer only a few hours ago, but now I sat with a can of ginger ale and a bag of chips, preparing for another episode of Pure Hell. The show wasn't on the network until the next night, but I settled in to watch the cable version at 10 o'clock. They called it live, and a lot of it was indeed live, but they showed a lot of pre-recorded material that they thought was too hot for the network. Not surprisingly, Sherry and her lover took up a lot of this time. I was in the living room while Lynn finished her homework in her room. I was pretty sure she was already done and just assumed that, given the direction the show was going, it would be difficult for her to be in the same room as me. She could also be trying to avoid seeing her old man cry, which was entirely possible. The show began, and it didn't take long before my dear wife was shown. It started with Jake and Sherry sitting by the pool with others. She looked fantastic in a skimpy white two-piece swimsuit that she must have bought for the show on the Saturday before she left. To say that I was conflicted is an understatement. She looked absolutely gorgeous, and part of me felt proud, knowing that a beautiful 42-year-old blonde housewife who could easily pass for a 20-year-old was my wife and lover. Then I wondered if she was still proud that I was her husband. She also realized that although the swimsuit fit her well, it was too revealing for a faithful housewife to wear in the presence of strange men. My heart began to clench at the thought, and it practically exploded when I realized that her intentions were to wear it for Jake, not for me, her husband. God, how I loved this woman. How could she not realize that her actions were tearing my heart little by little as I began to wonder what I might have to do if she went too far? Difficult decisions may be coming, and I wasn't sure I could make them in my condition. They got up and went to the sofa not far from the basina, and others soon joined them. Sherry had a towel wrapped around her, but she was still cold. Jake, like a true gentleman, pulled her closer and hugged her to warm her up. My heart was breaking, and my brain was suggesting ways to hurt this bastard who was hugging her. There was no doubt that he was in full seduction mode. Even worse, she completely accepted his advances. Her excuse letter might be that it was just part of the game and that she was just playing. I've known Sherry for a long time, and I can tell you right now that she is not that good an actress. Anyone with half a brain could see that she loved the attention. The other guests clearly felt very uncomfortable with their actions. This was especially true for the other two married women. It was obvious from their disapproving looks that what was happening was no longer part of the game, and this woman, whom they knew almost nothing about, was risking her marriage for something more than just money. The rest of the guests left for the night, leaving Jake and my wife on the couch outside. Jake started smoking and offered Sherry a cigarette. My jaw almost dropped when she accepted it and lit it. What the hell was going on? Sure, Sherry was a light smoker when we first met, but she quit smoking long before Lynn was born, mostly because she knew how much I hated it. I wasn't controlling, mind you, or lecturing her, but she knew I didn't approve of it because it was so unhealthy. And then my beloved wife takes a deep drag and then exhales a puff of smoke high into the air. She looked comfortable doing this, which made me wonder if she had been smoking lately and was hiding it from me. Then again, maybe she never quit and was an expert at hiding it from me. I didn't know what to think anymore. It also made me wonder why she felt so comfortable around this young guy, and if she had been doing something else all along and hiding it just as well. I would never have thought of this before that morning when the television crews arrived on our lawn, but now a seed of doubt was planted. As I watched them embrace, I felt like I was going to be sick. My heart just sank when Jake looked around to make sure no one was around and, seeing that they were truly alone, raised his hand above his head. As if on cue, she melted into his arms, as she had done to me so many times on our own couch while we watched TV. And like me, Jake lightly put his arm around her shoulder and pulled her closer. I honestly believed that at that moment, if Jake had asked them both to leave the show and cross the country robbing banks like a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, she would have gone with him without hesitation. Heck, Harley could drive the getaway car, which would free them up to make out in the back seat between bank robberies. By this time, Harley was becoming as cunning as his friend. Even the host, Katie Ross, could see that these two were having bro-mania. Despite what Sherry might have thought about Jake, the last thing he was going to be was a jealous person. All that mattered to him was that he got her. There was no real emotional connection on his part, and certainly no love. Jake loved only himself, and I believe that his only condition in sharing my wife with Harley would be that Jake would get her first, and then they would do it in turns. What the hell was going on with my life? The thought of my wife sharing was both ridiculous and disgusting, but a little over a month into the show, there was a possibility that another person might win it and do just that. I hated myself for even having such thoughts. When the late-night show ended, I wondered if the cable version was even worth watching. I wasn't sure if I could take any more of what I was seeing. The last thing I wanted to see was my beautiful wife being seduced by another man, but I couldn't tear myself away because I just had to know what was going on. Now, I've heard of husbands who love to watch their wives with other men. Let me just say one thing. I found nothing erotic in what was happening and winced at the thought of it going any further. Watching what was happening actually increased my blood pressure, the reason being that I had homicidal thoughts. It's not really erotica, is it? Lynn must have been upstairs watching because as soon as the show ended, she appeared in the living room with an incredibly sad look on her face. "Dad, I'm scared." "Why, pumpkin?" She walked over and sat on the other end of the sofa, but did not lean on her elbows. She was upset and nervous, and it showed in her body language. "This is Mom. She's acting strange." I hesitated for a moment before giving a well-thought-out answer. "Yes, I know. I can be frighteningly deep at times." My daughter continued, "Since when does Mom smoke? She's been lecturing me almost every day since I was 3 about the dangers of smoking, and here she is smoking on national television. What do you think she'll say when she comes back and finds that I've started smoking? I'll make it easy for you, honey. I'll spank you senseless before Mom finds out." She looked at me and giggled slightly when she saw my grin. She knew too well that I would never lay a hand on her or her mother. Then she became serious and said in a sad and worried tone, "What happened to her, Dad?" I shook my head and replied, "I wish I knew. I think she's just into the show and wants to win at any cost. Lynn hesitated before saying, I don't think you're completely right, Dad. I see the way she looks at this guy, and I don't think it has anything to do with the game. I hate to say it, but I think she might be falling for this creep. I smiled slightly, mostly out of pride that my little girl has grown up and can think for herself. Besides, she thought exactly like her old man. I also thought that Sherry was too easily seduced, and that she was actually starting to develop feelings for this guy, even though the game was far from over. Then she said something else that resonated with me. She looked straight at me and said, Dad, we have to do something before it's too late. It's already scary to think that Mom is ready to do anything to win the game, but I think there's more to it than that. I mean, it gets worse with every episode. She allows it. Your mother is a grown woman, and we must trust her decisions. Besides, there's not much we can do. I saw tears in her eyes when she asked, what if she makes the wrong decision? I hesitated before replying. Then she'll have to face the consequences, I guess. Lynn turned pale. Would you divorce her? I couldn't speak at first, but I nodded slightly. Then, with a crack in my voice, I answered, I don't know, dear. This is possible, but let's not talk about it now. She started to get annoyed, and it showed a minute later when she said, well, what are we going to do about this? There's not much we can do, honey. She didn't let me explain before she exploded. Damn it, Dad, are you just going to sit there and take it? I hear some people calling you a wuss, and it's getting harder and harder for me to defend you. Then she sobbed and covered her face with her hands so that I wouldn't see her tears. I didn't need to see her face. Her whole body was shaking. I just said, come here, lovingly, but a little insistently. She came and sat next to me on the couch, and I put my right arm around her and held her tightly for almost a minute before asking, do you really think I'm a wuss? She started to cry again, but stopped to say, maybe, no, I don't know, Dad. I'm so confused. I nodded and said, yes, so do I. I paused for a few more seconds before saying, listen, Lynn, I was debating whether to tell you this or not, but I guess you put me in a corner. Well, and also the fact that my pride hurts a little when I hear people call me a wuss, especially my own daughter. I saw the sadness in her eyes as she realized how deeply her words about me being a wuss had hurt me, but she still continued. What is it, Dad? You can tell me. I looked at her and wiped a tear from her cheek with my left hand and said, do you remember how I came back late yesterday and today? She nodded. Well, yesterday I called the executive producer of the show, some guy named Blevins. He's a little rat if you want to know the truth. Then I remembered I was talking to my daughter and apologized. She giggled and said it was normal and that she liked to see emotion in me. Well, you would have liked this call. In general, I explained to him the situation and my fears that my mother had gone too far for the sake of some kind of game. He explained to me that your mother signed a binding contract that all ties with the outside world were to be severed until she was eliminated, reached the finals as a contestant, or was eliminated and sent to that other house where losers are sent before returning on the final night to vote. House of Equals. What? Lynn rolled her eyes. It's called House of Equals. Mom will be sent there if she is taken out as one of the last 8. Yes, whatever it is. Basically, he said it wouldn't be fair to the other members if your mom got special privileges. He said any direct contact would have meant the contestant's immediate removal from the show. But Dad, doesn't he understand that this is an emergency? He thinks not. He said that if he felt it was necessary, he could perhaps talk to your mom on the side and tell her about my concerns, but that would be his decision, and he was not ready to make it yet. Why not? Dad, that guy is seducing Mom and could cause a divorce. You said it yourself. I understand, but this is a good example of how the world works and why most often it's about money. Money, I don't understand. This producer is a slug, honey, no question, and for him it's all about the ratings. He admitted that everyone in the audience was sitting on the edge of their seats, wondering whether the faithful wife and mother would fall or come to her senses before she went too far. I think these are called gold ratings. So, Mom was framed? It's not like that, honey. He admitted that he couldn't have asked for a better script than the one they have, and always hoped that some season would turn out that way. But I believe him when he says that people on the show are not told how to behave, and that their actions are not according to script. I paused before continuing. So we go back to your mom, who has to be an adult, and hope she makes the right decisions. Maybe he was lying about the contract being binding, Dad. Have you thought about this? Thought. So I talked to a friend at work yesterday. His brother is a corporate lawyer, and he said as a favor he'll look at a copy of the contract your mom signed and tell me if it's binding or not. That's where I went this afternoon. Is it mandatory? I'm afraid so. These online people know their stuff. We are really at the mercy of the producers when it comes to contacting your mom, and they will take their time. So we are at an impasse. She snorted and replied, Let's hope Mom isn't pushed into a dead end next time. She then blushed when she realized what she said, but I just hugged her tighter and told her I understood her disappointment. I also said that I agreed with her assessment of the situation. I could almost see the wheels swirling around in her head before she exclaimed, Well, let's take everything into our own hands. Like this, let's go and pick her up. We'll sneak in and kidnap her, or better yet, break through the front gate and force them to give her to us. You watch a lot of TV, right? She crossed her arms and frowned. Look, honey, I know your heart is in the right place, but we have to look at this logically. Don't get me wrong. I'd love to give them all a Rambo, but that's not realistic. At least the mention of Rambo made her smile. Look, Lynn, the studio lot and filming stages are guarded, and this house of equals, where they go if they are taken out, is not only guarded, but also in a secret place. Even if I get inside, I'll probably be caught long before I find your mom. I'll just end up in jail. I wouldn't mind going to jail if I knew it would stop your mom from doing something rash, or if I could protect her from these idiots, but that's not the case. No matter how hard I try, I can never get close enough to save her from herself. She sobbed, closing her eyes in agony. I knew this feeling. Besides, if I tried to stop her by doing something stupid and causing her to be eliminated from the show, she would hate me even more than she already does. She doesn't hate you, Dad. She still loves you. She has a very strange way of showing it, Punkin. Lynn realized that, given her mother's behavior, any attempt to reassure me that she still loved me would be a difficult task. I continued. At this point, the only thing we can do is hope that your mother will come to her senses and make the right choice on her own. She looked at me and said with a sad smile, It's nothing personal, Dad, but I was hoping for a better solution. Mom looks like she's lost her mind or something. I answered her sad smile with my own and hugged her tighter. I know, honey, I know. She hesitated for a moment before muttering under her breath. When did she become so stupid? Normally, I would have scolded her for talking about her mother like that, but since I was asking myself the same obvious question, I just let it slide. After all, when you're right, you're right. I debated whether to tell her about the one troubling option the lawyer had suggested, and decided that she had every right to know. Again, seeing that I was lost in thought, she asked, What is it, Dad? Well, do you remember asking me a little earlier if I was considering divorcing your mom? She sniffled and nodded. Now you should know that if this happens, this will be the last option. I mean, there might come a time when I can't. I stopped. She said quietly, I understand, realizing that it was difficult for me to finish the last sentence. I took a deep breath and continued. Well, the lawyer said the only legal option we have is to file for divorce. See, since your mom signed the contract, there's nothing we can do and no one to sue. But if I file for divorce, everything will change. Which things? By filing for divorce, in addition to the obvious result in our family, I will have the opportunity to sue Jake as well as the network for alienation of affection for their role in destroying our marriage. Oh, Dad, no. I'm not ready for a divorce yet, But your mother may reach the point of no return when this decision is made for me. I understand, Dad. It's just so sad. Sorry about all this, Pumpkin. And don't forget that she is still your mother. Don't let what she does to me affect your relationship with her. Nice try, Father, but don't you think that I also have the right to be angry? I smiled at my daughter and asked, Father, right? Since when did we become so formal? She smiled back and shrugged. I was proud of her, but I was also sad for her. Almost exhausted, I found enough strength to say, It was a long day. Let's try to get some rest. A few days later, I was sitting on our porch enjoying a cold drink after work when one of my neighbors walked by and waved hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure if he should, but had no choice as our eyes met. This brief gesture got me thinking. It didn't last long, but for a few moments it washed away the mental images of the bastard who had seduced my wife. My thoughts then turned to the various moods of our family, friends, and neighbors. At first, everyone was stunned. It's hard not to be like that if you know my wife. Then again, she'd flirted a little in the past, and that's it, as far as I knew. Although since this whole America is watching thing started, I wasn't so sure. Overall, as I said, everyone was stunned and also very sympathetic to me. I didn't really like that everyone felt sorry for me, but at least I knew they cared. It also confirmed my suspicions that there was a lot more going on than I wanted to believe, and that those close to me knew that I was more than just a jealous villain. They couldn't understand why Sherry did what she did, and that lifted my spirit a little, even if only briefly. Although slowly the mood began to change again. At first it was mostly men, but soon many women also started talking among themselves, and I got the impression that they thought I was weak for allowing this to continue. I think they thought I should do something instead of just sitting around waiting for my wife to come back. I even overheard several conversations when they thought I wasn't listening, saying that they would never tolerate such actions and would have done something a long time ago. Of course, they never specified what that something could be. Maybe that's why Lynn started having the same feelings, although I never asked her. Lynn didn't want to think I was a pushover, that much was clear, and she only hinted at it once. But I think my explanation convinced her that I really was between a rock and a hard place. Although I never asked her to do so, Lynn began telling others about my meeting with the lawyer and the helplessness I felt in being in the position of watching my wife being seduced from a distance with no way to intervene except to hope that my wife would come to her senses. At first, many men probably thought they would have done something different and bumped into the guy after breaking into the party. I'm sure that as they thought about it more, they realized that there was nothing they could do either. Getting past security at the studio would be hard enough, but then I would have to find the soundstage where they were filming and get there before I could run into my friend Jake. I, of course, would have been arrested long before Jake was beaten to within an inch of his life. Being the angry husband that I am, I have no doubt that my friend would have needed serious medical attention if I had gotten to him. And before you think I'm just trying to be manly, I firmly believe it's in anyone's best interest to avoid a jealous or protective husband. Rule of thumb, never poke a sleeping berry. This usually doesn't end well for poker. Eventually, most people realized that I did not approve of my wife's behavior, but that my options were extremely limited. Although during that awkward wave of my neighbor's hand, some believed that anything short of bursting through the studio gates with a machine gun in one hand and a knife clenched in his teeth was a sign that I approved of Sherry's actions. Another one of my neighbors was approaching, walking his dog. Instead of embarrassing anyone else by waving at me, I stood up and walked into the house with my beer. The next week on the show, it was business as usual. Jake was slowly seducing my wife, and while this was happening, he and Harley had the house to themselves. Obviously, they were capable of all sorts of treachery. As promised by Zach Blevins, the producers of the show called us and told us that a two-person crew would be coming to the show for Thursday night. It wouldn't be a big production, but they needed to set up lighting for the one camera they planned to use. I told Lynn that the network would be broadcasting live from our living room, and, unsurprisingly, she was upset. Her opinion was the same as mine. If we just sat there with smiles on our faces and acted like nothing was happening, her mom would think we were supporting her win at all costs mentality. I had an idea to get Sherry to understand before it was too late, and Lynn liked it. This was probably our last and only chance. Two people from the network arrived and set up their equipment about an hour before the start, as promised, and I could tell they were disappointed to see only Lynn and me. They asked who else would come and were even more disappointed to hear that everyone else was busy with their lives and would not be able to come. Both people were friendly enough and didn't seem to have the attitude that other Hollywood people I've talked to had. We were told that we would go live from our living room right after the first break. There was not long to wait. As they approached the first break, Katie Ross, the host, invited the show's contestants into their living room, where she was about to announce that one lucky winner would get to see their family and friends. I looked at Lynn and asked, "You are hungry?" She answered, "Yes, I could eat. What are you thinking about?" "Pizza." She stood up and answered, "Sounds good. Let's go." I took out my keys and followed her to the front door when a voice behind me called, "I'm sorry, Mr. Carpenter, but you can't leave now. You are going to live in the whole country." I giggled. "Actually, I'm going to get some pizza. Do you want anything?" "No, that's not the point." "Please, Mr. Carpenter, Blevins will kill us if you're not here." "Sorry, guys. It's nothing personal, but I just can't do it. If Blevins tries to blame you, I'll tell him you had nothing to do with it." "Fine." He nodded and said, "Mr. Carpenter, we watched the show and just wanted to let you know, well, we're sorry. We don't know what else to say except that we'll look after your house while you're away." I simply smiled and nodded, turning to catch up with Lynn. We had just walked into Pizza Hut when my cell phone rang, and I knew who it was without even looking. Lynn and I were parked when I responded in an exaggeratedly cheerful tone that didn't match my mood. "Oh, Mr. Blevins, nice of you to call. How's the weather in California?" "Very funny, Carpenter, where are you? My crew says you left for pizza, just as we were about to go live." "What does this all mean?" "What does it mean? Pizza. Well, this is an Italian dish that originated long before my time. I know what pizza is, smart guy. I'm talking about the fact that you left before the live broadcast." "Oh yes, about that. I think my daughter and I are shy today. We're embarrassed, damn it. Listen, go home right now. I don't know whether you were told about this or not, but you often say, 'Damn it.' Listen, Carpenter, this is Mr. Carpenter for you." He paused for a moment, swallowing some pride before continuing. "Please, Mr. Carpenter, listen to reason. If you come home right now, we can still have your family together on air for the first time since the show we taped you on your lawn. We already chalked it up to technical issues the first time, but we really need you and your family to show up. The more the merrier, remember?" "Oh yes, I remember, but I'm afraid we won't be able to today. Maybe we'll try it another time, but then I can't promise I won't be craving a taco or a cheeseburger." Blevins was getting irritated, which was good for me. "Time to play big, Mr. Carpenter. If you do not return home immediately, we will take legal action for breach of contract. Have you forgotten that your wife signed a contract to be on our show and have us broadcast live from your home with 24 hours notice? So what's the problem? Sherry is on your show, and your crew has contracted access. You may have forgotten or were not informed that I have never signed a contract with anyone associated with your network, nor has Lynn or anyone else in our family. We have a dog. Would you like me to ask him if he would ever agree to show up? It's at my mother-in-law's today, but it wouldn't hurt to ask. He may not like the short notice because he will need to go to the groomer first." There was silence on the other end before he answered. "Your wife was depressed when she expected to see her loving family, but instead saw that they abandoned her. Is this what you want? I honestly don't care what you tell her. Tell me, did all her housemates come over to console her, or just one or maybe two?" Silence again from the West Coast. "Look at it this way, Mr. Blevins. At least my wife didn't have to sit and watch her replacement hug me like I had to watch her replacement hug her. Now you're clearly watching the show, So tell me the truth before we go any further. Was this bastard right next to her, and she looked like she was not only allowing it, but comfortable? Zach Blevins hesitated at first before asking. I'm not sure what you're getting at, Mr. Carpenter. Let me make this as simple as possible. Did they look like a couple? They looked like a damn couple with chemistry. After a few moments of silence and an audible sigh, he simply said, "Good night, Mr. Carpenter." I was angry when I hung up, but I was still more confused and heartbroken. As Lynn and I continued walking towards the restaurant, she said, "You really enjoyed tugging on his chain, didn't you?" I gave a sad smile and answered, "As much as I can enjoy anything these days, honey." So, on to more important things. What will we order for pizza? This moment of pleasure was too short, but at least it was something. As I said earlier, Lynn taped the show that night, and even though I already knew what to expect, it still broke my heart to see it with my own eyes. Since Lynn and I were already on our way to Pizza Hut when the show started, here's what we missed. The host greeted America after the final commercial break amid loud applause from the audience outside the house where Sherry sat. Katie Ross asked Sherry if she wanted to see her family and friends live from their living room. Sherry seemed delighted and had tears of joy streaming down her cheeks, but that would soon change. Oh, the tears will remain, but the joy will disappear. Part of me felt terrible. Despite everything, I still loved her, and my first reaction was to still defend her. But seeing what I saw seemed to justify my actions of leaving the house. At least I felt vindicated. Sherry did seem genuinely excited to see us, but she looked very relaxed, too relaxed, sitting leaning against another man with his arms wrapped around her. It was that chemistry again, and I actually felt a tightness in my chest. Did you understand? My loving wife, with real tears in her eyes, is looking forward to seeing her family for the first time in a long time, all while she sits holding another man. If I could get to my lover, I would kill him with my bare hands. It definitely wasn't part of the game, and the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that nothing she was doing now had anything to do with the game. Katie Ross, the host, looked very uncomfortable with the proceedings, as did most of the players. Jake, however, had a smirk that could only mean one thing. Although he had never met me, he laid claim to my wife by rubbing my nose, knowing there was nothing I could do about it. It was fueled by Sherry's words that I was weak and didn't care. The only other person in the room who seemed to approve was Farmer Harley. He looked like a big kid standing first in line for a roller coaster, knowing that after Jake had completely seduced my wife, he would be next. Anyway, I watched in horror as Sherry sat in his arms, caressing his chest as if they were on a movie date. Speaking of movies, it was a show of the times. When the cameras turned on in our house, Sherry stared at the empty couch and equally empty room. Katie, the presenter, immediately tried to justify herself by saying, "I think we have technical problems. Let's take a break and be back soon." Sherry was very upset when she saw the live feed from our living room and, of course, started crying again. I wasn't sure why, because I doubted whether she still remembered who Lynn and I were. If she remembered, it might have been the first time since she left our house. Where did she find refuge from the pain? She turned and buried her face in Jake's chest, like she did with me during a scary movie or a thunderstorm. He immediately began to console her with words like, "You deserve better," and "We'll talk about this later." I was seething. Now, if you think that my actions might push her into his arms, remember that she was already there when the cameras rolled. Nobody pushed her anywhere, and although the cameras were rolling, there was no way I could tell her I loved her and beg her to come home. Plus, if you remember, I begged her not to go before all this started, and look how that worked. If she was ready for me to see her for the first time in over 6 weeks in the arms of another man, she clearly loved me no more than she loved our couch. On the other hand, maybe that was why she was crying. She saw the sofa and realized how much she missed it. I also wasn't sure what was worse, her inability to realize that she was destroying the family, or the fact that she realized the possible consequences and was prepared anyway to live your fantasy. Regardless, she had serious problems and chose to ignore the obvious. Our marriage was on the rocks, and my hand was on the switch. As Sunday's network broadcast began, I began to question my sanity for enduring the humiliations my loving wife inflicted on me on a daily basis. Sherry's actions made me physically sick and worse, but she was slowly eating away at my heart with every tick of the clock. It didn't matter whether I was looking or not at that moment, because now that I had those images in my head, that's all I could think about while working, driving, eating, and sleeping. Friends and family stopped talking to us about the show, and I think they decided it was a sore subject. Our friends and family were right, but Sherry and America is watching were still the #1 topic between Lynn and me. We searched for answers and leaned on each other for support. If it weren't for Lynn, I would be in much worse shape than I am now. That says a lot because I was a complete mess. We were both in the living room when the next show started, but it was becoming increasingly difficult and awkward to watch together. By now, we were in week 7, and all this time people had been pandering, hitting back, and voting for each other. The game continued, but like previous seasons, when I watched it with my wife, I didn't really care about any of the people. Well, except for 3 this season. In addition, 8 people were eliminated from the show, meaning that anyone who voted for him did not go home, but went to the House of Peers. Here they will remain until the final show, where these 6 people will return to vote for one of the last 2 survivors to determine the winner. Sherry was thrilled to have made it this far, although I was less than happy about it. Much less than happy about it. In fact, I was more convinced that her enthusiasm came from the fact that she had to spend more time living out some deep-seated fantasy with her boy toy than competing in the game. Didn't she see what she was doing? Fan of the show or not, she had long since crossed the line of what could be considered acceptable behavior for a faithful wife. Although I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, I was able to eliminate one possible cause. It wasn't pure stupidity, because no one could be that stupid. Jake won the competition that week and earned the right to be head of house, which gave him the right to have his own room. Beautiful. My fears reached a new level as hope seemed to have completely left me. Believe it or not, things got worse. All was well until the end of that night's show. That's when the dive happened while everyone was sitting in the back. Jake stood up, and I saw what this arrogant jerk had no use for. He stretched and then said he was tired and was going to take a shower, looked at my wife, raised an eyebrow, and winked. A moment later, Sherry agreed that a shower was a good idea and followed him inside. The other guests were stunned. The son of a bitch stopped and let her catch up so they could walk through the house together, hugging each other. And here comes this damn chemistry again. Damn, even though it broke my heart, even though I was thinking of them as a couple at this point. It was impossible not to do it. As soon as they closed the door behind them, the others immediately started talking about them, and the network suddenly decided not to give out the words bitch and cheater, but did so for 1 or 2 adjectives said before them. Katie Ross appeared on camera to end the show and seemed upset about what had just happened. I assumed she was trying to remain impartial, but I thought I heard more than a hint of disapproval in her voice. Lynn and I were both on edge as we watched the show in near silence. It was like we were both waiting for the axe to fall, but if we hadn't talked about it, it wouldn't have happened. Good idea, even if it didn't work. That's how the network episode ended when I switched to cable. My emotions were all over the place, and I wasn't sure I was ready to see what might happen next, but I couldn't resist. Like the rest of the show up to that point, I didn't want to watch. I just needed to know what was going on. Lynn was already sobbing. I had a really bad feeling before that night at the cable show, and apparently Lynn did too, because after the show opened, she stood up, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I'm feeling a little tired, Dad. I'm going to bed." In fact, I knew she would be watching it upstairs in her room. I didn't want her to do it, but she's a big girl now and has the right to watch if she wants. It was easy to see that she, like me, was afraid that something would happen tonight that a father and daughter should never watch together. The knot in my stomach was reaching incredible proportions, and I was sickened by the knowledge that what was happening could not be stopped, and that there were thousands of miles between us. The cable show was about to start when I noticed that I was having trouble watching TV. I was glad Lynn came upstairs because I was already starting to cry. As I mentioned, what a fucking nightmare. Sherry sat down on one of the shower chairs, still wearing the same skimpy white bikini she wore to the previous show. Jake was wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt, but when he took off his shirt, I thought Sherry's eyes were going to fall out of their sockets. I don't know why, because she had seen him shirtless before, but maybe because this time they were all alone. I don't know. Jake then steps into the shower and begins running the water before disappearing behind a partial shower door that allows viewers at home to see him from his knees to his chest or neck, depending on the person's height. He then looks at my wife and asks, "Would you like to join me?" She then asks, "What do you think my husband would say if I went into the shower with a young hottie like you?" Even though she mentioned her husband, she had no doubt that I was the last thing on her mind at that moment. I have no idea how this is even possible, but I have witnessed it myself. The love-struck boy just grinned as she approached him. I began to shake my head, silently pleading out loud, "Oh my God, don't do this, baby. Please don't do this to me. We can still get through this if you stop now." Despite everything going on, I was still shocked to see Sherry accept Jake's invitation to take a shower. A moment later, she came in and closed the door. Almost immediately, Jake took off his swim trunks, hung them over the door, and pulled Sherry towards him, inviting her to take off her bikini. She initially refuses, fearing that someone might see them in the shower together. The way I thought about it was that the other 6 people were still outside, so Sherry wouldn't have to worry about them. Of course, her daughter and husband would see, as well as the rest of the United States and anyone else in the world who had a companion, but other than that she had no reason to be embarrassed. It was also alarming that at that time, this was her only fear. Sherry pulled away, but only to do what I thought was unthinkable. She took off her top and hung it over the door next to the asshole's underpants. Tears began to roll down my face as he pulled her towards him again, now completely naked. I started begging again to no one in particular, "Oh God, honey, please stop. Please don't do this to us." I couldn't see what he was doing, but he must have tried something because Sherry said, "No, not here. Someone might catch us. How about we finish and go to my room?" She looked into his eyes and smiled sweetly, as she had done to me millions of times over the years, and quietly said, "Okay, but just hold me for a few minutes." They got out of the shower and went to Jake's room, the leader of the house. He crawled under the blanket and, smiling at his wife, asked if she was cold. She smiled sweetly, a smile that was once unique to me, and quietly replied in an almost childlike voice, "A little." He pulled back the covers, and just like that, for the first time since we were married, Sherry went to bed with someone other than me. It became clear to me that the cameras and microphones were pointed at my wife and her lover, almost to the point that they were having their own show. Probably, when under stress, a person thinks about the stupidest things. At first, it was just cuddling and talking under the covers, Sherry telling Jake everything about me, her faithful husband. Unfortunately, the bastard steered the conversation in the direction he wanted. Unsurprisingly, she didn't point out that I worked hard to provide for my family, that I coached kids baseball and hockey in my rare free time, and that I fulfilled almost all of her wishes with a smile. Instead, she said that I don't always support her emotionally. What does this even mean? We always talk to each other about what we did that day or how we felt about any issue one of us brought up. Did I really need to get a degree in psychiatry to better care for her emotional needs? Where did this even come from, and did they at some point replace my wife with this imposter? Then she said that I was not intimate enough with her as she would like. I have tried many times to rekindle passion, only to hear that she is too tired or that she is not up to it today. In fact, from before the start of the show, it had been several months since we had been intimate. Again, it's not like I didn't try. Now I'm not young. I would like to say that I am no longer young, but in fact I never was. I've always been average. However, she never complained. Until now, and she put all the blame on me. You might think, well, if you weren't the man of her dreams, maybe that was the problem. But even as an ordinary guy with extremely limited sexual abilities, did I deserve all this? She continued to say that she wished I could spend as much time with her as Jake did. I wonder why that is. How can he spend so much time with her and I can't? Probably because they're locked in this damn house together and they have nothing better to do than try to get my wife. Not to mention, the lover doesn't have to mow the lawn or shovel snow in the winter. He doesn't have to go to parent-teacher conferences or fix things around the house. And there are some other things I forgot that I can't remember. Oh yeah, I need to work 8 or more hours a day to support my family. It didn't seem to matter much in my wife's eyes. It was even harder to realize that if she could betray me so easily, perhaps I had never mattered much in her eyes. They both spoke in low voices, and I began to feel nauseous again, realizing that this intimacy was usually just between Sherry and me, but now I began to realize that many of those things that were reserved for just the two of us no longer mattered. It was in these quiet tones that my world began to completely collapse. Jake asked, "You don't seem happy with your husband, do you?" She giggled a little and hesitated, and I wanted to believe that she would be too embarrassed to answer the question, although by this point I already had a pretty good idea of what the answer would be if she answered honestly. Instead, she quietly replied, "Yes, mostly." I noticed that she hesitated again, as if she didn't want to go into detail. It should have been obvious because even the bastard noticed it. "What were you going to say?" he asked in a concerned voice that certainly didn't match the level of concern he actually felt for her. This smug bastard. She started to blush and replied, "Listen, I don't feel comfortable saying that. What if Walt or my daughter sees this?" She must have thought that the shower was just to follow the old expression that cleanliness is the closest thing to godliness. Maybe she thought taking a shower with him amounted to a religious experience, and I would accept that gratefully. Speaking for myself, I know I kept repeating God's name while I was watching. Of course, I added things like, "God, no," "God, please stop," and the popular, "Damn you." The lady's man's smile grew even wider as he replied, "How can they see that? How can anyone see this? We are locked here in the house leader's room, in my room, safe from the others, and believe me, they don't suspect a thing." She giggled nervously and replied, "What about television, idiot?" Ah, their first fight, I thought. Maybe they will find a way to make peace. I'm sure my buddy Jake will come up with something. He pretended to be offended, and she giggled again. If it weren't for the situation, her laugh would have been cute. "You're safe, Sherry. They never show such things. They can't. The kids are watching, so we can talk about anything." He paused for a moment and, raising an eyebrow and showing a sinister smile, said, "We can also do whatever we want, and no one will know." "Are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm sure. You said you watched every episode of the show, right?" "Yes," she answered, but it was drawn out and sounded more like a question, as if she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. "Do you really think this is the first time a married woman has been romantically involved with another man, a man who loves her more than her husband? Are you saying you love me? What do you think?" She smiled and blushed. He didn't even say he loved her. It would be a lie if he said he loved her, but he didn't and probably couldn't because the bastard had never loved anyone in his life. He was just using her, playing on her feelings to get what he wanted, even though she couldn't see it. But it was clear from the look on her face that she thought she heard it. She only heard what she wanted to hear, and in her mind she heard him say he loved her. She was lost in the moment and lost in her fantasy. I wanted to jump through the TV screen and shake her so that she would come to her senses. This guy was terribly cunning, but he was still a piece of shit. Jake made the most of his time having Sherry trapped with him and kept me trapped at the same time. I was trapped because he knew I would watch him slowly seduce my wife, and it gave him the perfect opportunity to humiliate me. Using my complete powerlessness to his advantage, he asked her in a loving and caring tone, "Is he good in bed? I mean, is he really doing this for you?" This bastard really was a romantic devil, wasn't he? She didn't answer right away, although she finally said, "Well, he thinks he's good in bed and he tries really hard." She paused before continuing, "Don't get me wrong, he's very sweet and wants what's best. He's just not good enough most of the time." I just sat there staring at the TV. My emotions were all over the place, although I didn't have time to process it all before they continued their assault on my soul. A moment later, I noticed movement under the blanket and knew from the direction of the movement that Sherry's hand was somewhere it shouldn't be. To make matters worse, it was clear from the movement and the pace of it that something was happening that clearly should not have happened to a wife or anyone other than her husband. They continued to speak in low voices, but the microphones picked it up as clearly as if she was shouting from the top of a mountain. Did she hate me? I thought about it. My anger was enormous at that moment and competed with the deep sadness that was tearing my heart apart. Jake then tells her that he's close but doesn't want to sleep on a wet spot. Sherry smiles maliciously and then dives under the covers. Once again, I began silently begging the empty room. "Please stop, honey. Don't." Adding salt to the open wound, the favor she had just provided to her lover was something she had never done for me because she always said it was disgusting. Not that it was on my mind at the time, but I think it's worth mentioning now. Even with Sherry's betrayal, I couldn't help but feel a little bad for her. Oh, sure, there was a part of me that wanted to strangle her, but I couldn't help but think about what everyone would think of her later and what she would have to deal with for the rest of her life. People will whisper behind her back, and she will have to face her family and friends, most of whom are conservative like me. As I said before, the worst thing for me was that I could do nothing but watch as my main reason for living cruelly betrayed me. She didn't know it yet, but our marriage was no longer collapsing. It was over. Even though I didn't want it, life went on, and the sun rose on a new day. I cried all night, or rather, the little time that I slept, but by lunchtime my decisions had already been made. The decisions themselves were quite simple because of Sherry's actions. The hard part was living with these decisions and making them. I never expected this to happen to my marriage, so I was like a ship caught in a storm on the ocean. I was completely lost and didn't know where to go. I needed help and support from those who were willing to help. One of the things I had to do was leave before Sherry returned. I had time, of course, because even if she was kicked out of the house, she would still have to stay until the final show in that House of Feasts, or whatever they call it, and that last show was almost a month away. I needed to leave. I couldn't face her, and I certainly didn't want to talk to her ever again. I was willing to do whatever it took to distance myself from all of this. But it wasn't just about getting away from Sherry. Because of her, I wanted. No, I needed to get away from almost everything and everyone associated with my soon-to-be former life. My daughter Lynn was the only exception to my desire to leave everything behind. But ironically, we were still to be separated. Regardless of the distance between us, I intended to talk to her as often as she would allow me. My first conversation was with Lynn. I told her I might be leaving soon, and if she wouldn't mind staying with her friend Debbie, if her parents didn't mind, they could go to school together in Maine in a few weeks. I then spoke with my boss and asked for a transfer to our office in DeLand, Florida. This was one of the many things I needed help with, and luckily my boss accommodated me and not only arranged the transfer, but also arranged housing for me. He never said it outright, but it was obvious that he was probably watching the show with his wife, and his willingness to help me in any way he could came from putting himself in my shoes. I really couldn't thank him enough, and I told him so. I then spoke with a lawyer to discuss many other details. He turned out to be a pretty good guy. I know, I was surprised too. We talked about divorce, and he was shocked to learn that other than a few $1,000s to start a new life, I was leaving the marriage with nothing. I just wanted to get out of it and give the house, her car, and all of our savings, which amounted to several $100s, a fair price to me. Everything was paid off, so she and her new lover would be provided for the rest of their lives and could live happily, completing her fantastic life. You may ask, why not try to destroy her the way she destroyed me? Well, it's simple. I still loved her and always will. I think that was the most painful thing. To love someone as much as I do, and at the same time hate her almost as much, if not more. I was also well aware that my approach to the divorce was the worst choice I could have made, but if it meant she wouldn't fight it and I'd never see her face again, then it would be money well spent. My proposal, obviously, did not suit her, but not because of finances, but I am getting ahead of myself a little. We will return to this issue later. It was time to play hard on the net, and my first shot went straight to Zach Blevins' head. Why try to scare him when you can hit him on the head right away? I told my lawyer my idea, and when he finished laughing, he said it could work, although he was the first to admit that the entertainment industry was a completely different world. I assured him that he was my man, and I wanted him to handle any possible settlement. But a lawsuit, and I mean a high-profile lawsuit, would be the last resort. Now is the time to try to negotiate a deal with the show's producer, something that would make the network, Lynn, and me happy. My idea was far from a guarantee, but it was worth a try. One of the downsides was that Blevins could still be about married to Lynn and I for leaving the living room in front of the cameras recently. If he held a grudge, he could have just told me to shove my deal up his ass. Believe me, I wanted to hit them as hard as possible, but I knew my best chance was to stay realistic. Any threat of a lawsuit will likely remain just that, a threat. They have too much power for me to stand up to them, and even if I had a good case, they could drag it out in the courts for the next 50 years, not to mention the legal costs would be astronomical. So my legal team, well, my team of one, advised me to ask for a reasonable amount and said they probably wouldn't be found liable. Basically, I was going to take what was offered to me. My lawyer said that Blevins, the same producer who showed my wife's fall on the national stage, and the ITN network actually agreed in principle to my proposal within an hour. One of the things that made us successful was my lawyer mentioned that I could always go on talk shows and basically criticize the highest-rated show in America. They were actually afraid that I would carry out what they thought was a fairly innocent threat. Hey, what works, works, right? But what really caught their attention was my idea that would send their precious ratings through the roof. My lawyer said that when Blevins heard my proposal, he was practically delighted. We had to come up with a few backup plans in case the game didn't go the way we wanted, although we ended up going with Plan A. That's the only thing that's gone right since this whole thing started. Oh yeah, and the network actually agreed to bribe me, that is, reward me with $800,000 and pay for my daughter's college education, as long as I didn't file an individual lawsuit and name Blevins or the network in a future lawsuit. To be fair, it was probably still a drop in the bucket for the network, although I found it ironic that Sherry went on the show to win $500,000, and I received a check for $300,000 more than that. Don't get me wrong, money won't make up for my lost marriage and humiliation in front of the nation by any means, but it's better than nothing, and it will help me get settled in Florida and start my single new life. Mind you, my ultimate dream would be to go back in time and get my old life back. I had a lot of things to do that kept me busy, but I still felt like hell. The network show didn't air the next night, so not many people were going to see the upcoming spectacle. Unfortunately, our family and friends, as well as most of our hometown residents, will be watching. Lynn will watch in her room under the excuse that she is too tired to watch with me. There was really nothing I could do to stop her. As I said earlier, she was old enough to understand what was going on. Despite this, we seemed to have an unwritten and unspoken rule of no longer watching the cable version together. While the network show may have been awkward to watch together, the cable version was as close to adult films as it could get without actual nudity. They blur the nudity, but it looks like Sherry's best moments were under the covers. Nothing much happened until half an hour into the show, when Sherry was on the outdoor couch, smoking with her lover and Harley, the other bastard. Was this the same woman I married? Jake then whispers to my wife to join him in bed. She blushes and smiles sweetly, and every wrong step she takes tears me apart. He then stands up and offers his hand to help my wife up, like the true gentleman he will never be. Still holding her hand, he leads her into the kitchen, where the rest of the house is sitting around the counter, talking. Everyone was shocked by the brazenness of this bastard as he led my wife past them like a sheep to the slaughter or a virgin being defenselessly offered up for sacrifice. She looked so vulnerable, so sweet and innocent, that part of me still wanted her to be mine, even though I could never live with her betrayal, a betrayal that was not yet complete. Sherry followed him upstairs to his room, her gentle hand in his, as the remaining members of the house looked on with disgust. Step by step, he took over my wife, and I could not do anything. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't understand what was going on in her head. She did look a little timid, perhaps unsure if she was doing the right thing, but there was no resistance, and there was a sparkle in her eyes that indicated her excitement at being alone with him. The feeling in my stomach told me that new indelible images would soon emerge to add to my collection of sadness. Would you say just look away? Believe me, it's not that simple. I wanted more than anything to turn away, but something pulled me. It was the same with Lynn. Perhaps it was just a temporary lapse of common sense. I really didn't know. It didn't take long before they reached his room. He stripped naked, and the producers smeared what was necessary. The cable version was virtually unedited, especially the audio, but the video was a different story. The blurry parts saved it from becoming an adult film, but didn't leave much to the imagination. After a few minutes, he asked her if he was giving her more pleasure than me, and she nodded and smiled. After a few more questions, he asked one that I never would have thought of before. Million years. It was intended to bring the completely helpless husband to the breaking point. He asked in a fake caring tone, "Have you ever had an affair?" "What do you mean? Like an old romance?" This caught both his and my attention for the same reason that she didn't deny it correctly and wanted to clarify before answering. He grinned, and I felt like I was going to get sick again. It could have been a heart attack, or just vomiting, or perhaps both, but something had to happen. In fact, if I had been offered a fatal heart attack at that moment, I would have gladly accepted it and said thank you. She then admitted that she had an affair with one of her colleagues while they were traveling to out-of-town conferences. She said she slept with him every night they were gone. Thinking back, I remembered how she only made a couple of trips a year for 4 or 5 nights. When Jake pressed her, she admitted that the affair had lasted about 3 years, and the excitement she felt that first night far outweighed any guilt she might have felt. She also said that by the end of the conference, she couldn't wait for the next one. When he asked if there was anyone else, she admitted that she had dated one of our married neighbors a few times in the past year, but it had never been serious. My heart sank again. Then he asked a question that nearly gave me a heart attack, which I was now openly rooting for. "Have you ever done this in bed with your husband?" "You mean the neighbor?" "Yes. He was always in our bed at home. He didn't really make enough money to rent a room, and I couldn't risk using my credit card and leaving a paper trail. In your husband's bed? It's sexy." "Yeah, I have to admit, it was pretty exciting. We mostly met during the day, and the possibility of getting caught always enhanced the experience." "Wow, this is cool. While your husband works hard for his family, you made her a neighbor in your marital bed." He grinned. Now, for some reason, he was poking her nose into her business. I began to believe that he was a sadist. He then asked, "Has a neighbor ever visited you while your husband was out with your daughter?" "What do you mean?" "Well, you told me that your daughter played softball in high school. Did your lover come and do it in your bed while hubby was at her game?" She shook her head and moaned, "No." I held my breath and exhaled loudly when she answered, relieved that she wasn't so heartless. My relief was short-lived as a moment later, she added something that made my heart stop for a moment. It happened. When my husband volunteered to be an escort at my daughter's graduation, my neighbor came and... From Lynn's room, I heard a scream, "That damn bitch." Part of me wanted to call her and tell her not to talk about her mother in those terms, but who the hell am I kidding? The kid got his way. Lynn's scream drew my attention away from Sherry's confession for a few moments, but soon what little sense I had left returned to me, and I pieced together what I had just heard. In fact, My first thought was, do I even know my wife? After all, not once on the night of my daughter's graduation did I think she was home knocking boots with the married neighbor. I never thought I had a reason for this. Speaking of graduation, did I mention that it was only a few weeks before the damn reality show started and that she refused help because she wasn't feeling well? No, I didn't mention this before, did I? And if you're wondering if I know who the neighbor was, the answer is no. I wish I did, though. Then I watched as they were about to have sex. I heard things being thrown in Lynn's room. I felt sorry for her. I wanted to hug her and tell her that everything would be fine and everything would pass, but that would have been a lie of epic proportions. Moreover, what father would want to be in the same room with his daughter under such circumstances? The floodgates opened and a stream of tears streamed down my face. Did any of this turn me on? Absolutely not, and I knew I would never be able to erase the images from my memory, which made me doubt if I would ever be able to touch a woman again. I was crushed beyond repair, and that fatal heart attack I had hoped for was sounding better and better. Although my time in our family home was suddenly coming to an end, the thought of spending another night in our bed seemed disgusting to me. Instead, I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up at 3 in the morning to go to the bathroom, but found myself covered with a blanket. My daughter must have visited me at some point and covered for her dear old dad. She still loved me and cared about me, and damn did I need that. When I returned to the couch after the night's relief, I sat there for a while, thinking about how much I was going to miss Lynn when she went off to college in Maine this year, but at least I didn't spill tears for this. I couldn't if I tried. I cried all the time. The show returned the next night, and it just so happened to be Jake's last night as leader of the house. I didn't care at all about the game, about who won or who left, with the exception of 3 people. Even then, the damage was done, but I couldn't help but watch. In that sense, I think I was as bad as the rest of America. About half an hour into the show, host Katie Ross gathered the players in the America is Watching lounge, where she'll ask a few house guests a few questions. She started with Sherry and asked her if she felt guilty for putting herself in compromising positions with certain young men on the show. Sherry started giggling and Jake hugged her as she explained that she and her husband had discussed the possibility of something like this happening and that he was okay with it as long as it remained part of the show and that she would be his faithful wife when she returns. The host then asked if that meant she and her husband had an open marriage, to which Sherry giggled again and replied, "I guess you could say that." At home, Lynn, who was lying on the floor watching the network version with me, turned and asked, "Dad?" Unable to speak, I simply shook my head and stared at the screen in anger and disbelief, watching as my once faithful wife continued to strike at my heart. Lynn turned back to the TV, satisfied that the silent answer meant her mother was lying, and that I would never agree to such a thing. We realized that her mother was caught up in the hype and excitement of the show. Even when others talked about their families to tears, her reaction was not so sincere. She rarely mentioned family, and when she did, it seemed as if she was talking about some shared family rather than her own. Lynn later told me that she saw her mother look at Jake with love, and it filled her with shock and disgust. Her heart was breaking, and she couldn't even imagine how devastated I was. She admitted that she wanted to turn and look at me to make sure I was okay, but she was afraid of what she might see. After a few minutes, hearing several sobs, she stood up and left the room. She was well aware that her world, and in fact her family's world, had changed forever and that nothing would ever be the same again. She knew that her mother, her incredibly stupid and selfish mother, was the only culprit. Despite arguing with her mother in the past over minor issues, this week was the first time she thought of her as a bitch. I was already dead inside, and Lynn knew it, even though we both knew there was nothing anyone could do about it. And then there was a cable broadcast that same night. Like I said, this was Jake's last night as leader of the house and his own room. In baseball terms, I was expecting a fastball when fate decided to throw me a curvy ball. The expected fastball would have been bad enough, but the curvy ball hit and hit hard, and what it broke was my will to live. Jake and Harley made a deal. If Harley promises not to put Jake up for eviction, he will help Harley bond with the once loyal and loving suburban housewife who has become his plaything in the house. Jake said that he was going to lie down for a while and looked at Sherry with a grin, which was a clear invitation to join him. She waited a few minutes before getting up and entering the house, saying that she was tired too. This move did not fool the remaining players, who looked at each other and continued calling her a bitch behind her back. She walked up the stairs and slowly opened the door, but didn't realize that Harley was waiting for her in Jake's bed in the dark room. Again, everything happened quickly. I heard the sound of breaking glass and immediately thought that Lynn had thrown something and broke something in her room. But when I looked at the liquid running down the living room wall, I realized that it was I who threw my glass at the wall. In case you're wondering, it was a direct throw out of pure frustration. 2 nights later on network, airtime some guy got kicked out, but who cares anyway? Then it was time for the backyard competition, or whatever it's called. Sherry wins some games by answering more stupid questions than everyone else. Sherry becomes house leader for a week. No need for the backup plans we discussed with the network. Let's move on to Plan A. After a commercial break, the host welcomes America back to the show. The group of 6 are sitting in the living room when Sherry is told that she is allowed to receive a letter from home. I couldn't believe how excited she was, and it really seemed genuine. Why she was so happy, I couldn't say. After everything she went through on the show, and even her 2 infidelities, you'd think reading a letter from her boring husband would be more of a chore than something enjoyable for her. Now, I don't mean to brag, but I really outdid myself with this letter, and could only hope that Sherry would appreciate the time and effort that went into it. Katie Ross, the host, said, "We have a surprise guest here who will deliver your letter." Sherry put her hands to her lips in surprise and asked, "Is it Walt or my daughter Lynn?" At that moment, a man in a suit came through the door, walked up to her, and asked, "Are you Sherry Ann Carpenter?" Thinking it was still part of the show, she giggled and replied, "Yes, I'm Sherry Ann Carpenter." He handed her a large manila envelope and said, "You have been served with a subpoena." There was a loud gasp from the studio audience watching outside the house, as apparently the presenter had not been warned in advance about what would happen. There was even applause, which for some reason made me happy. Everyone seemed to be in shock, except for Jake and Harley, who simply looked at the camera and grinned. Sherry began to cry and lose control, but being the caring lover that he is, Jake came over to comfort my wife. He hugged her, held her close, and began to whisper in her ear in a soothing tone. Although I was far from Los Angeles, I still managed to wipe the grin off Jake and Harley's faces for at least a moment when they also received a manila envelope. Of course, their envelopes were intended for a claim for alienation of affection. Her lead only lasted a few minutes as they voted to evict 2 people from the show that night. Some women got kicked out, then another competition took place and Harley won. While all this was happening, it was clear that Sherry was visibly shaken. She was just going through the motions, not knowing what to do or what was more important, the show or her marriage. In my opinion, she should have tried to win the show because her marriage was already over. But it wasn't to be, and after Sherry was one of the 2 people nominated for eviction, she was sent to the banquet house, where she had to wait until the last night to vote for the winner. It was not an easy night. Sherry metaphorically punched me in the face so many times that I lost count, but she was also punched on the way out. The deciding secret vote to evict her was cast by none other than her love interest on the show, Jake. I guess he didn't need her in the house anymore, and she was stopping him from winning $500,000. In House of Feasts, she was joined by Jake, who was eliminated the following week. The feast house doesn't have many cameras, but while the evicted guests sat in the living room, Sherry sat on the love seat with Jake, not only next to her, but with his arm around her. When the host asked if they continued their romance in the new house, Jake immediately and proudly stated that they had decided to share a bed and that last night was probably the best night of his life. What a scoundrel. There are no cameras in the bedrooms in the House of Feasts, so even if I assumed they continued their dirty deeds, I might not know for sure. But when Sherry looked down and blushed, I knew it was true. God help me, I realized it was true. She continued the affair in the House of Feasts, and there is no excuse, because for her the game is already over. She had nothing more to achieve. Not that her actions could be justified within the framework of the game, but even her twisted logic could not explain the continuation of the affair after her elimination from the game. It was another blow to the face. I thought this was the final blow, but believe it or not, there was even worse to come. Finally, the night of the final show arrived. They introduce the members of the House of Feasts, and as they come out one by one to loud applause from the audience, they enjoy the last moments of their 15 minutes of fame. But not every greeting was loud and enthusiastic. When Harley came out, the applause was polite at best, with a few shouts. He was clearly not happy with this turn of events. Jake came out next, and as the booing increased, he began looking around to see if anyone was about to attack him. His smirk disappeared as it became clear that he was being seen as the bad guy. Really, what did he expect? Sherry was then introduced, and she came out in front of a live audience. She was greeted with a few faint applause and a few shouts, but mostly there was silence. I couldn't help but think that indifference was worse than catcalls. She sat down on the stool next to Jake, but he didn't try to hug her. Did the lovebirds really have a quarrel? Hoped that wasn't the case because they seemed like such a cute couple and had great chemistry. That would be a real shame, wouldn't it? Her eyes scanned the crowd as if she expected to see her husband and daughter there. But this did not happen. Lynn was already settling into her hostel in Maine, and it was my third night in my new apartment in DeLand, Florida. The host behaved professionally with Sherry throughout the entire show, even though it was obvious that neither she nor the audience approved of my wife's actions. This brought me some comfort, but by then I was practically inconsolable. In the end, some won, some lost, and the show generated the network's highest ratings of all time, second only to that year's Super Bowl. Who cares? Sherry eventually contacted my daughter, and Lynn told me what happened after the last show. After unsuccessfully trying to reach Lynn and me from her hotel in Los Angeles, she tried to contact her parents and sister, but the result was the same. Sherry's family didn't intend to disown her completely, but they apparently needed time to process what had happened over the last 3 months and weren't ready to take her calls. She later told Lynn that when no one answered her calls, she began to realize how much she had screwed up her life. How she hasn't seen this before is incredible. Damn. There were red flags even before she left the house that fateful morning a few months ago to get into that damn limo. When Sherry arrived at our airport, hoping that we would meet her, she found herself completely alone. She actually had the nerve to be mad at me for not meeting her at first. I forgot to meet her. Well, of course. She took a taxi home and found the house dark and Lynn's things and my things missing from our closets. Sherry told Lynn that she burst into tears on the spot and fell asleep right there on the bedroom floor. My daughter was the one who called me a few weeks later to tell me that her 42-year-old mother was pregnant. Hearing this should have made my husband happy, but not in this case. Simple arithmetic showed that I was not the father. It could only be Jake or Harley. And here it comes. The final blow to the face. It took a while to get there, but as I told you earlier, the worst was yet to come. I was already through with my wife, however my daughter was still hoping for some kind of relationship with her mother. Well, her pregnancy put an end to that. Sherry Carpenter was truly a master at alienating loved ones, friends, and even acquaintances. No one could take that away from her. Not exactly a gift from above, but it is what it is. For all her misdeeds that led to these record ratings, all she received from Itten for her lost marriage and the alienation of her once loving husband and daughter was just $5,000. Jake and Harley continued their brotherly relationship after the show ended, with Harley moving to Atlanta to share a bachelor pad with Jake. Sherry gave birth to a baby girl 3 months ago. A DNA test showed that Jake was the biological father before she was born, but as expected, he denied any responsibility. Even though Jake was a complete loser, his family had money, and they used it to dismiss my alienation of affection claims against him and Harley. My lawyer warned me that this could happen, but it was worth it to shake their cages and expose them as the scoundrels they were. Their lawyers also managed to convince the judge that Sherry lured poor Jake into sex as part of a game called America is Watching. In the end, Sherry got nothing and faced even more attacks from the media, especially daytime talk shows and syndicated variety shows. I followed further developments with some interest. Lynn is cautious about a possible relationship with her new sister. I don't think anyone can blame her for that. She says that although she has nothing against the child, she just can't bring herself to meet her yet. Lynn admitted that much of her resistance stems from the fact that she is not yet ready to see her mother. Although they talk on the phone from time to time, Lynn has no plans to visit her anytime soon. Lynn says phone conversations are short, but not short enough for her. I also have nothing against the baby and was glad to hear that she was born healthy and happy, and I wish her all the best. But that doesn't interest me anymore. This topic is no longer subject to discussion with anyone anywhere. For what reason? I believe that the story I have just told justifies my reluctance to speak on this topic. At this point, it is only fair to sum it up and tell you how my meeting with the court-appointed consultant, psychiatrist, psychologist, or whoever ended. This will also include her opinion and not just my thoughts. I can say that at first I was wary of her, but by the end of our long session, I began to respect and even sympathize with her. Anyway, Dr. Nancy Royce listened carefully to my story, but said little as she invited me into her office and asked me to tell my side of the story. Now I was just summing it up in the doctor's office by saying, so America is Watching became a ratings bomb and a hot topic for a few weeks after the show ended. But eventually all the noise died down and people moved on with their lives, and our personal nightmare was almost forgotten by the majority. However, there are those of us who will live with this for the rest of our lives. It was far from a game for us, and if I had known then what I know now, I would have superglued Sherry's feet to our living room floor. The doctor smiled slightly. Who knows, maybe if it weren't for the show, I would never have found out about the other two infidelities, and we would still be married. On the other hand, if she had cheated before and was willing to cheat on national television, well, I really don't know what to believe. In any case, since she returned home, she tried in every possible way to delay the divorce. I hope that she will just leave things as they are. Not only will I never talk to her again, but I'm not going to ever be in the same room with her. This should give some idea of my feelings towards a possible reconciliation. So, at our last court hearing, the judge scheduled us to see Dr. Nancy Royce. Of course, my lawyer told me about this, since he is conducting the entire divorce in my absence. And here I am, doctor. Although I have to tell you, counseling is the last thing I wanted because there is no way I will ever be able to take Sherry back. The first time she disrespectfully kissed that loser, I knew it was over. But at least you're here, Mr. Carpenter. Well, this or prison, there won't be a next time. Would you rather go to jail? Not really, but something like that. Her expression became serious, but she left it without comment. She leaned forward and began, Mr. Carpenter, I asked you to tell your story as honestly as possible, and I must admit, I was very impressed with you. How the hell did I do that? Let's just say I'm glad I asked the judge to schedule an individual session with you. I know you wouldn't be so outspoken if your wife were present. Because if my wife was here, I'd still be in Florida. However, you have been very open with me, and I really appreciate it. I have to admit that usually husbands come into my office, swear at their wife, and blame her for everything that is wrong in their marriage. But you didn't do it. She paused for a moment before continuing, No, Mr. Carpenter, you were focused more on your emotions and your daughter's emotions. It was very revealing and helped gain my trust. I didn't know I had to gain your trust. She laughed and said, This is the best way. That's why I booked such a long session. I really wanted to meet you, and I think we succeeded. She paused again and then added, Do you mind if I present my theory about why your wife behaved the way she did? Were you able to form your humble opinion based solely on court records and one meeting with my wife? From my point of view, this is not enough. No, Mr. Carpenter, my humble opinion, as you put it, is not based solely on the notes provided to me by the judge in your divorce case or from one meeting with Mrs. Carpenter. In fact, I've been working with your wife for almost a year now. This surprised me. I don't want to offend you, doctor, but this looks like a setup. Believe me, this is not true. Let's leave it at that. And Sherry knows that I will talk to you soon and told me that I can reveal everything that we have talked about so far. Maybe? I simply nodded. She sensed that I was not very enthusiastic about listening to something like weak excuses or psychological jargon. She understood this and quickly added, I know you are skeptical, Mr. Carpenter, and no, I am not suggesting that you accept what I am about to present as an excuse for your wife's actions. In fact, I am not going to suggest that you accept any explanation for your wife's actions. All I ask is that you remain open and listen to me. Can you do this for me? I simply nodded for her to continue. Mr. Carpenter, there's no doubt that Sherry was in a perfect storm. It all started with the very idea of participating in the show, and from that moment on, everything took its course. She wasn't just a fan who loved watching the show, you already knew that. Your wife seems to have lived for the sake of participating in this show. In her mind, from the moment she was chosen to participate in the series America is Watching, she was in a fantasy world. When she opened her mailbox on that fateful day, she essentially became a different person. We are working hard to understand why she allowed herself to become such a different person. She took the cap off the water bottle and took a sip. I have a possible explanation or explanations for why she could get so close to this man while she was away from you. While I am the first to admit that we have yet to find the definitive answer we are all looking for, I believe we are moving in the right direction. I remained silent, and she continued, This is a very difficult situation, and I am afraid that everything I say will be difficult to hear. Continue, I said, clearing my throat, although I immediately doubted the correctness of my decision. I have heard of similar cases before, although I admit that I have never seen it happen so quickly. I have a theory about this, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Then I said with a smile, Come on, doctor, post it. I have a business. She realized that my remark was just friendly banter, so she smiled and continued. Mr. Carpenter, I believe that your wife had difficulty distinguishing the reality of this television show from reality itself. I believe that deep down she missed you terribly, but could not find a way to express her regret for leaving you. Seriously, did she miss me and become Jake's wife? She leaned back and said, smiling slightly, You're very perceptive, because that's what I mean. Oh, come on, doctor. She is a grown woman. She knew what was right and what was wrong. Perhaps not in the way you might expect. I think she's been clinging to him in your absence. As you said, she became his wife while she was on the show. It made her feel secure and loved at home with you and your daughter. So why didn't she adopt a daughter to complement her new husband? She laughed a little before replying, again, very insightful. I was confused and demonstrated this with my next brilliant question. What? You're on the right track. I rewatched the whole season and noticed she was getting close to one young woman, even though she was on the other team or whatever it's called. She became a motherly figure until she got kicked out of the show early on. I believe that by temporarily hosting a new family, she was able to cope with the stress of being on the show. But she wanted to be on the show, after all, that's what she lived for. I agree, but subconsciously she probably felt enormous guilt for leaving you and your daughter. This Jake and this young girl gave her back a sense of comfort that she had been missing in her life. Was that supposed to calm me down, doctor? She just shook her head, giving me time to think about it before I said, So, in a way, she was trying to replace her family. This is right. On a purely temporary basis. Unfortunately, when the show ended, Reality hit her right between the eyes. She didn't understand that what she was doing was wrong, even if it was temporary. And of course, I didn't understand how it might look from the outside. Just look at how deaf she was to most of her housemates' comments. I wasn't sure I agreed with everything she said and thought it was an exaggeration at best, but it was probably plausible, at least to some extent. After a long pause, she said, "There is another possibility, and frankly, it is something that could either play a role in what I just laid out or work independently of it. In any case, I certainly am not going to do you or your wife any favors by telling you this." I asked the obvious question, "What is this, doctor?" She hesitated and took a deep breath. "There is a possibility that at some point she completely fell out of love with you." She read the sadness on my face. I'd never thought about it myself. In fact, I'd often assumed it was the reason for her actions, or at least part of the reason, but hearing it from someone qualified to make such assessments stung. "Please, Mr. Carpenter, there is a good chance that this is not the case. You yourself said that until the day she opened the mailbox, there were no problems between you except for periodic quarrels. Moreover, her falling out of love with you does not explain how she could leave her daughter, not to mention her sister and parents. But separation would help explain her other infidelities, wouldn't it?" Shaking her head, she replied, "Not necessarily, but it can't be ruled out. It's hard to say for sure." Well, that probably almost explains it in a way. She laughed good-naturedly. "Sorry, Mr. Carpenter. This was clearly not my most, let's say, convincing answer. You see, doctor, watching her get seduced on national television was bad enough, wasn't it? But then I had to calmly listen to her. Well, calmly tell her new lover about her previous infidelities. Damn. I heard her reading the shopping list with great excitement, and she never showed a hint of remorse. I knew she was being teased then, but she still calmly confessed. I stopped and took a deep breath, and then added, "How can someone do something like that to a person they love? The answer is you can't, and if she cheated during our marriage, it means she never really loved me." There was almost a minute of silence. Finally, she broke it. "I would tell you in small steps, Mr. Carpenter, that we are in the early stages of Mrs. Carpenter's treatment. I would be lying if I said I had all the answers. Admit it, doctor, you're also not sure that she still loves me, is not it?" She thought for a few moments before giving a balanced answer. "Well, I think she likes the idea of marrying you, Mr. Carpenter. I wish you would say more." "Me too, Mr. Carpenter, me too." I shook my head. Most people don't find out about their spouses cheating on national television, so when you think about it, there's nothing real about reality TV, is not? No, they aren't, and I'm afraid Mrs. Carpenter will find out the hard way. There was an awkward silence, followed by an even more awkward conversation. "I'll be happy to help you too. I would like to ease your pain and perhaps restore your marriage." I sat looking at her diplomas hanging on the wall and didn't know what to say. "Mr. Carpenter, I have already told you that my work with your wife is far from over, but I truly believe that she can return to the woman you fell in love with and married." "Why? Sherry was clearly never the woman I considered my wife, was she?" I answered her sharply. I paused for a moment before continuing. "Don't get me wrong, this is not revenge on my wife. I don't wish anything bad on her, really, and if you think you can help her, I say go ahead, but you'll have to do it without me. I don't care. I'm dead inside." After another silence, I added, "Please, doctor, haven't my daughter and I suffered enough? The whole thing was pure torture, and it seems like the only person anyone really cares about is the one who caused it all. What about Lynn and me? I don't want to be selfish, but how the hell are we supposed to move on with our lives?" "How's Lynn holding up?" "As you know, Lynn is attending college in another state and is adjusting as well as one would expect. I'm very grateful for this. She still has friends back home, but she also has new friends and her life is getting better. I don't know what the future holds for her, but she has proven that she is a very resilient young lady." "How are you doing, Mr. Carpenter? How are you holding up? Were you able to move on? I hesitated, searching for an answer. It wasn't easy. I'm trying, doctor. I really am trying. You already know that I moved to Florida before the show ended, and I'm still there. I couldn't stay in our hometown. Everyone was kind to me, but to see these pitying glances everywhere I went. I fell silent, not bothering to finish or continue my thought. My lawyer does everything he can, but sometimes it's impossible, like this consultation. I had to fly here, and I will have to do that for any future sessions. Wouldn't it be worth it if we could save your marriage? It won't work. There's nothing to save. She gave up everything to participate in a TV show. What kind of petty act is this? And on top of that, she also insists that my daughter, and I forgive her for wanting to fulfill her dream, now she can appear in any other reality show. Show or live with some handsome young man who will turn her head, I won't stop her anymore. In a caring voice, she asked, "Despite everything that has happened, do you still love your wife, Mr. Carpenter?" I took a deep breath and sighed before repeating the question and answering. Do I still love my wife? Yes, I love you, but she is dead to me. She cocked her head to the side, like a puppy who doesn't understand a command. I must say, this is a very interesting point of view. I don't remember nakedly anyone saying they loved a person and at the same time declaring that person was dead to them. Could you explain this more? It's actually not that hard to understand. Have you ever had someone close to you die? Someone you really loved? Yes, but have you stopped loving him? Dr. Royce smiled slightly and simply replied, no. I looked at my hands and continued, I still have some kind of love for her and always will. I can't just turn it off, no matter how much I want to. But eventually I accepted that I had lost her. It breaks my heart, and it took time, but I got over it. She is no longer mine, and as it turns out, she never fully was. I took a break to collect my thoughts, and she gave me the time and space to do so. Everything might not have been so if I had not seen it with my own eyes. All this, damn. I would never have known about her cheating if I hadn't looked. I mean, I think someone else might have told me, but my voice faded again. She sat and watched me struggle with my thoughts before finally breaking the silence. I know you said it was hard to tear yourself away from the broadcast, Mr. Carpenter, but can you tell me why you wanted to watch it so much? I didn't want to watch. God knows I didn't want to, but I couldn't turn away. It was like watching one of those wildlife shows where you see a cute zebra about to be grabbed by a lion. You want to stop this somehow. You scream at the TV to warn the poor defenseless animal about the impending danger, but you can't do anything and you can't look away. Sherry was the prey and that bastard was the predator, and there was nothing I could do about it except watch. Perhaps in time, if the judge does grant a divorce, you will be able to find someone special. I shook my head. I don't think so, doctor. Perhaps over time the pain will subside. I hope so. But I'm not sure about these images. Those damn pictures of Sherry and those guys. My mind even makes me imagine her with the guys from her 2 novels, and that's just my imagination. I don't understand how I can ever trust another woman again. No offense, of course. No hard feelings. But you know, the news said that the internet is flooded with letters from all over the world from women wanting to meet you. Exactly what I need, a chance to let another woman down. You can't be serious about this. I cannot. You heard what she said about me to the whole world. I stopped and Dr. Royce didn't interrupt me, giving me time to finish my thoughts. I said in a broken voice, I will never forget how they planned her seduction and how they carried it out while I watched helplessly from 3,000 miles away. And all this time I couldn't do anything about it. Nothing. But the worst part wasn't the foreplay or the sex or even the fact that I found out about the other cheating. I choked up, trying to say what I wanted without bursting into tears. My voice trembled from the very beginning to the end. The moment when my heart really stopped, when I wanted to die, was not about sex, not about finding out about the betrayal. This was the moment when my wife, the only lover I had ever known and the mother of my daughter, allowed another man to lead her around the room like a sacrificial lamb, showing the world, especially me, that she now belonged to someone else. Then to see the look of anticipation in her eyes as she followed that bastard up the stairs to his bedroom towards the end of our marriage, and to know that she wasn't thinking about me at all. I finished the sentence bitterly. And now some judge, a complete stranger who doesn't really understand the situation, thinks that it's better for us to kiss, make up, and forget about the past. So tell me, doctor, will my life turn upside down once a week for the sake of some meaningless consultations? No offense, of course. She didn't say anything, just looked at her notes. I couldn't help but think that at that moment she would rather be anywhere but here. So, Dr. Royce, here is my story. You wanted to hear it, and here it is. Do whatever you want with her. But know that if you suggest another meeting, especially one involving my wife, you and she will be disappointed. Honestly, I'd rather commit suicide than talk to her again, and if it comes down to it, I'll do it. It's not a threat, it's just a fact. I felt a tear roll down my cheek as the effects of reliving my personal nightmare intensified. She looked at me for almost a minute without saying a word. It was clear that she was trying to gauge my resolve before she finally returned to her notes and slowly shook her head. Then she slowly leaned back in her large leather chair and pressed the fingertips of both hands together as if she were praying. She hesitated, but finally said, "I don't think it's necessary to give you additional sessions, Mr. Carpenter." Then she leaned forward and closed the folder, and, meeting my gaze, said, "I agree with you. I think you and your daughter have been through enough in the last year that I honestly don't know anyone who could handle it, let alone forgive and forget. In many ways, you are an amazing person, Mr. Carpenter." "I don't feel amazing. Hell, I don't feel anything at all." She paused before adding, "I will inform the court that the marriage is beyond repair. I sincerely hope that you can improve your life, at least for the sake of your daughter." I just nodded my head and breathed a quiet sigh of relief that someone other than my daughter had finally taken my feelings into account. "Before you go, Mr. Carpenter, there are a couple of things I'd like to discuss." She looked at me again and began, "You were not trying to harm your wife, physically or financially. In fact, besides keeping your retirement account and car, you gave your wife everything else, including the house, her car, and all the bank accounts. That's very impressive, Mr. Carpenter. Let me tell you that your wife was pleasantly surprised and appreciates it very much." I nodded in recognition. She's suffered enough. She was rejected by her own parents, all our friends, and almost all of America. I don't want to cause her more pain than she already has, even though I can't be around her anymore. I just want to get out of this. Thank you for understanding." I paused for a moment before adding, "Doctor, I haven't known you for so long, but I trust you. Probably more than I should, but I trust you. If I ask you a question, will you give an honest answer?" She looked me in the eye and said, "Yes, Mr. Carpenter, if I know the answer. You were very frank with me, and I think I owe it to you." I nodded and continued, "I noticed that you are wearing a wedding ring." She smiled, "Yes, I do, Mr. Carpenter, but I guess that's not the question you want answered." I smiled sadly, "Now you are perceptive." She laughed, "Thank you." "To your health." I replied, then added, "I just want to know if your husband was on the show and did to you what Sherry did to me, all things being equal, including the reasons you think are possible." I stopped, and she completed my question. "Would you forgive him and take him back?" I smiled sadly and nodded. She smiled back and shook her head and said, "No way. I can see how this has destroyed you, and I'll tell you honestly, I wouldn't have reacted any differently than you did." She hesitated before adding, "I know this is only one side of the story, but in this case, I can see the recording of what happened, so I don't have to take your word for it. I also saw this with my own eyes. I just needed to gauge your emotions. Moreover, your wife confessed to most of what happened." She paused, then said, "I don't know how to approach this, Mr. Carpenter, so I'll just say that there are things that bother me about the implications of all this." Could you stay a little longer and talk to me about this? I promise that this will not affect my decision in any way and that everything we talk about will remain between us. If you want medical confidentiality." She stopped and took a sip of water, making me wonder where this conversation was going. I actually had a pretty good idea, but I was hoping it wouldn't come up. I shrugged, then nodded for her to continue. There were several incidents mentioned in the court case where authorities initially considered you a suspect. She looked up, but I remained calm and silent. She continued, looking through her notes. "The first incident happened with one of your neighbors shortly before you moved to Florida. One night he was attacked while leaving a bowling alley. He initially told police he recognized you as your attacker, although his wife claimed it was two much shorter men." She looked up, hoping for a reaction, but there was none. She continued, "The police report states that his wife repeatedly mentioned that her husband was having an affair with an unknown woman from the area." I was silent. "You were never questioned because your wife was sure it wasn't you." A few days later, her husband changed his story and told the police that they were two short men. I sat quietly. "Another incident in the case involves two men from the reality TV show America is Watching, who were found seriously beaten in an alley outside a nightclub in Atlanta." She paused for a moment, gauging my reaction, which was not there. "I wouldn't know about it. I don't really watch the news. Life is complicated enough to make other people's problems juxtapose your own." Dr. Royce smiled and continued, "I read that they wanted to question you as a suspect, Mr. Carpenter, but even though you matched the description of the attacker, you had an impeccable alibi." I said nothing again. "According to the story, you were on a friend's boat in the Florida Keys all weekend when the attacks occurred. You didn't tell me that you had a new friend in Florida and that your friend was a local judge." "Well, you didn't ask. But this is not a secret, especially after it was published in the newspapers. He is a good friend, and we have a lot in common. His wife also cheated on him and then tried to destroy him. It's not exactly the same situation I found myself in, but I think mine is a little unique." She continued to smile. "You know, I want to remind you of medical confidentiality." With a slight smile, I simply replied, "Okay. This definitely won't be my biggest professional moment, so I hope you don't think any less of me. I just really wanted these three to get theirs and for the good guy to win." She paused, searching for words. "I don't know how to ask this, but this is what intrigued me the most. I have this feeling in my stomach, and I just want you to confirm." She stopped and sighed, as if hesitant to ask a question that might be inappropriate. It was my turn to finish her sentence. "Confirm that I was the one who put Jake, Harley, and my neighbor in their place?" She nodded slightly. I got up from the chair, turned around, and took a few steps towards the door. I stopped, turned to her, and saw the disappointment in her eyes as she looked at me, almost desperately searching for the answer she so wanted to hear. I took a deep breath and said with a hint of satisfaction, "Always trust your gut." She smiled wider than I could have imagined and said, "I wish you all the best, Mr. Carpenter. Tell your daughter she has a wonderful father." My smile was much more modest, but sincere, when I replied, "Take care of yourself, doctor." I walked out of her office and into what was left of my life. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.